There's a line in an ancient Sumerian text that no scholar quite knows what to do with. It appears in a creation story carved into clay around 1700 BC, and it describes something that shouldn't exist in mythology. Gods who understand they can be erased, not defeated, not temporarily banished. Erased. The text comes from a tablet excavated at Nippur in southern Iraq, now catalogued as CBS 10673 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. On its weathered surface, pressed into clay by a scribe's reed stylus 4,000 years ago, appears a phrase that translates uncomfortably into modern language. In describing the Anunnaki, those beings credited with establishing civilization, teaching agriculture, organizing the first cities, the ancient writer uses terminology that suggests vulnerability. The Sumerian words don't speak of eternal deities expressing displeasure with mortal failings. They speak of beings who recognized constraints, who operated within boundaries, who understood, perhaps, that their existence was measured in time rather than stretching beyond it. Before we go deeper into what that means, and why it changes everything about how we read these ancient records, take a moment and tell us where you're listening from tonight. Comment below whether you're drifting towards sleep in Vancouver, watching morning light spread across the walls in Mumbai, or finding a quiet hour anywhere in between. There's something fitting about voices from across the globe gathering around a question the Sumerians themselves might have whispered in temple corridors after the official hymns ended and the ritual words gave way to uncertain speculation. What if the gods could die? The question opens like a trapdoor beneath our assumptions. Because if the Sumerians understood the Anunnaki as powerful but ultimately finite beings, then every text must be read differently. The desperate quest for immortality that drives the Epic of Gilgamesh becomes something other than poetic meditation on human mortality. The detailed accounts of gods requiring healing and rejuvenation stop being metaphorical and start looking like procedural documentation. The strange, specific descriptions of divine bodies that could bleed, tire, require sustenance, and be wounded in battle shift from symbolic language to observational record. And most tellingly, the death of gods themselves, recorded not as seasonal metaphor but as events that required explanation, ritual response, and cosmic reorganization. Most visitors to the Penn Museum walk past CBS 10673 without a second glance. It sits among 30,000 cuneiform tablets, part of a civilization's compulsive need to document everything from grain inventories to astronomical observations. The tablet is damaged, sections missing along its right edge, considerable loss at the bottom, but enough survives to reconstruct the core narrative. It contains what scholars call the Eridu Genesis, sometimes known as the Sumerian flood story, an account of antediluvian cities, the creation of humanity, the relationship between mortals and the beings who governed from temple platforms. But within that familiar narrative framework appears something that doesn't quite fit our categories of myth versus history. The text presents the Anunnaki not as metaphorical forces or symbolic representations of natural phenomena, but as entities the Sumerians observed and recorded with the same matter-of-fact precision they used for crop yields and architectural specifications. The scribe who pressed these marks into wet clay chose specific words. Sumerian, like all languages, contains gradations of meaning, subtle distinctions that separate one concept from another. The terminology in this passage doesn't employ the standard formulations used for timeless divine beings. expressing righteous anger at human transgression. Instead, it uses phrasing that translates to something closer to existential recognition, beings acknowledging that they, too, existed within a framework that had endpoints. What if that's exactly what it was? Not poetry, not allegory, documentation. The idea unsettles because it requires us to reconsider the entire foundation of how we approach ancient texts. Are we reading theology or testimony, mythology or memory? The line between those categories may be far less clear than modern scholarship assumes. The ancient world operated under a framework we've largely forgotten. To the Sumerians, the word we translate as God, Dingir in Sumerian, Ilu in Akkadian, didn't carry the same metaphysical weight it does in modern theological contexts. It denoted beings of a different category than humans, certainly. Beings with capabilities humans lacked, knowledge humans didn't possess, lifespans that dwarfed human generations by factors of hundreds or thousands. But the texts themselves, when read closely, when examined with the same analytical precision the Sumerians applied to mathematics and engineering, suggest those beings existed within the same fundamental reality as humans. A different tier of existence, perhaps, but not an entirely separate ontological plane. This creates an uncomfortable possibility. What if the Sumerians recorded what they saw? What if their texts preserve observations of entities who arrived, established cities, organized agricultural systems, constructed monumental architecture, and governed for periods of time so extended that they seemed eternal to human observers, but who were, in fact, as subject to mortality as any? Biological system, just on a vastly different time scale? The implications cascade outward from that single question. If the Anunnaki faced mortality, then their relationship with humanity shifts from theological framework to something more complex. The creation of humans, described in texts like Atrahasis as a solution to divine labor exhaustion, stops being creation myth and starts resembling workforce logistics. The transmission of knowledge, agriculture, writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, becomes not divine gift but practical necessity, powerful beings ensuring their systems could continue after they themselves were gone. The construction of massive temple complexes transforms from houses of eternal gods into something else, monuments perhaps, or archives, or systems designed to outlast their creators. And the obsessive Sumerian drive to record everything, to press into clay not just poetry and mythology, but grain receipts and astronomical observations and mathematical calculations and legal precedents, all of it preserved with equal care, all of it treated as equally important, that begins to look less like religious devotion and more like the behavior of a civilization that understood knowledge was fragile, that what was known could be lost, that memory required physical anchoring in clay and stone because the beings who held that knowledge wouldn't be present forever. Over the coming hours, we're going to examine specific tablets, specific texts, specific words pressed into clay by scribes who left us a record we're only now learning to read with fresh eyes. We'll look at what the Sumerians actually wrote about the Anunnaki, not what we assume they meant, but what the words themselves say. We'll trace patterns across multiple independent sources spanning more than a millennium. We'll examine the mainstream interpretations, the overlooked details, and the alternative readings that emerge when we take the Sumerians at their word. We'll explore the Atrahasis epic's account of gods who toiled, exhausted themselves, and rebelled against crushing labor, divine beings who experienced fatigue. We'll examine the death of Dumuzi, recorded not as seasonal allegory, but as an event that required cosmic intervention and left other gods genuinely grieving. We'll investigate why Gilgamesh, himself partly divine, desperately sought a plant of immortality if divinity itself granted eternal life, and why that plant grew at the bottom of the sea, hidden, requiring specific knowledge to obtain. We'll look at texts describing divine bodies that could be wounded in battle, poisoned by venom, aged by time, and texts describing the procedures for healing, restoration, and rejuvenation of divine flesh. We'll analyze the mathematical precision of lifespans recorded in the Sumerian king list. 28,800 years for one ruler, 43,200 years for another. Numbers that dwarf human experience, but remain firmly within the realm of measurement rather than infinity. Numbers that could, theoretically, end. We'll examine lamentation texts that describe gods fleeing cities under attack, unable to protect their populations, retreating in ways that suggest limitation rather than choice. We'll look at underworld narratives where divine beings become trapped, unable to escape, existing in a state that resembles death, even if it's not precisely that. We'll trace the transmission of divine powers, the me in Sumerian, those fundamental aspects of civilization that could be stolen, transferred, lost, suggesting they weren't inherent qualities but portable knowledge or technology. And we'll ask the question that hangs over all of it. If the Anunnaki were not immortal, what were they? And what does that mean for everything the Sumerians built, everything they recorded, everything they tried desperately to preserve in clay? The answer, or rather, the exploration of possible answers, begins 5,000 years ago in southern Mesopotamia, in the cities that rose from the mud flats between two rivers, where human civilization as we know it first took recognizable form. Before the flood, between heaven and earth. To understand what the Sumerians might have known about the Anunnaki, we must first understand who the Sumerians were and what made their civilization so profoundly different from anything that came before. Southern Mesopotamia in the 4th millennium BC was not particularly hospitable territory. The land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq consisted largely of marshland and arid plain, subject to unpredictable flooding, lacking in stone, timber, and metal resources. The summer heat was crushing. The winter could bring devastating storms. It was not, on its face, ideal real estate for building the world's first urban civilization. And yet, by approximately 3500 BC, cities had begun to rise from that unpromising landscape. Eridu, later remembered as the first city, established on a mound above the marshes. Uruk, which would grow to house perhaps 50,000 people at a time when most humans still lived in villages of a few hundred. Nippur, Lagash, Kish, urban centers featuring monumental architecture, complex administration, specialized labor, and a level of organization that represented a fundamental departure from everything that had come before in human history. The Sumerians didn't just build cities, they invented the systems that made cities possible. They developed irrigation networks that transformed desert into agricultural surplus, canals and dikes that controlled the unpredictable rivers and made reliable food production viable. They created writing, cuneiform script, initially as an accounting system for tracking grain stores and livestock, which then evolved into a medium capable of recording everything from astronomical observations to epic poetry. They established standardized weights and measures. They developed sophisticated mathematics, including place value notation and understanding of geometrical principles. They created the first known legal codes, formalized religious institutions, organized long-distance trade networks reaching into Anatolia, Persia, and the Indus Valley. All of this happened with remarkable speed. The archaeological record shows the transition from scattered agricultural villages to full urban civilization occurring over perhaps 5 or 6 centuries, an eye blink in evolutionary terms. The Sumerians themselves had explanations for this rapid development. Those explanations consistently involved the Anunnaki. The term Anunnaki appears throughout Sumerian cuneiform texts. Its etymology remains debated, but generally translates to something like princely seed or offspring of An, referring to An or An, the supreme deity associated with the heavens. The Anunnaki were described as a collective of divine beings who descended from An and Ki, who established order, who taught humanity the fundamentals of civilization. In the Sumerian worldview as expressed in texts, the Anunnaki weren't abstract forces. They were entities with individual names, specific responsibilities, particular personalities, and defined roles within a cosmic administration. Enki was associated with wisdom, water, and creation. Enlil governed air, storms, and administrative authority. Inanna, satyr known as Istar, ruled war, love, and political power. Ninhursag was connected to birth and the earth. Each major city had its patron deity from among the Anunnaki, housed in massive temple complexes called ziggurats that dominated the urban landscape. These weren't merely symbolic representations. The temples functioned as administrative centers, economic hubs, and repositories of knowledge. The gods weren't abstract concepts worshipped from afar. They were treated as physically present beings who required housing, food offerings, administrative support staff, and regular ritual attention. The texts describe the Anunnaki giving audiences, making decisions that affected human populations, requiring specific procedures for approaching them, and maintaining what reads very much like governmental authority. Now, here's where mainstream scholarship has traditionally drawn a clear line. The consensus interpretation treats all of this as mythology, sophisticated mythology, reflecting the Sumerians' way of understanding their world, but mythology nonetheless. The Anunnaki, in this view, represent natural forces given anthropomorphic characteristics or social structures projected onto cosmic framework, or metaphorical explanations for the origins of civilization and order. This interpretation is academically defensible. Ancient peoples across the globe created mythological frameworks to explain their world. The Greeks had their Olympians, the Norse had their Aesir and Vanir. The Egyptians had their elaborate pantheon. Mythology serves psychological, social, and explanatory functions in human cultures. The Sumerian texts can reasonably be read through this lens. But there are details in the Sumerian texts that sit uncomfortably within that framework. Details that are oddly specific, strangely procedural, and remarkably consistent across sources that were written centuries apart and in different cities. The texts don't just say the gods created order. They describe specific individuals performing specific functions using specific methods. They provide architectural specifications for divine dwellings. They record administrative hierarchies. They document what reads like technological knowledge, irrigation engineering, metallurgy, astronomical calculations attributed to Anunnaki instruction. Consider the me, a Sumerian concept often translated as divine powers or divine attributes. The me encompassed everything from kingship and priesthood to scribal arts, metalworking, and city building. In texts like Inanna and Enki, these me are described as tangible things that could be possessed, stolen, and transferred. Inanna famously gets Enki drunk and steals the me, transporting them from Eridu to Uruk. The story is usually interpreted as political allegory about the transfer of power between cities. But read literally, the text describes knowledge being physically transported. Procedures, perhaps. Instructions. Technological understanding contained in portable form. The me weren't personality traits or moral qualities. They were specific capabilities that could be acquired, lost, and transferred to others. The Sumerian approach to recording all of this was distinctly unpoetic. They were compulsive documentarians. They recorded everything with the same matter-of-fact precision. A temple hymn praising Inanna received the same careful cuneiform transcription as a receipt for 53 sheep delivered to the temple of Enlil. Astronomical observations sat in archives next to legal contracts. They made no apparent distinction between sacred and secular knowledge. All information was valuable. All deserved preservation. This is a civilization that invented writing primarily for accounting, for tracking resources, for maintaining accurate records across time. Their approach to the Anunnaki, at least in many texts, carries that same accounting precision. Not poetic rapture, but documentation. This god held this position. That god performed that function. This event occurred, had these consequences, required this response. The Sumerian king list exemplifies this approach. It's a remarkable document existing in multiple copies, the most complete being WB 444 from the Weld-Blundell collection, now in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. The list provides a chronological sequence of kingship from the mythological past through historical rulers, whose reigns can be verified through other sources. It opens with the line, "After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu." Then it proceeds to list rulers and their reign lengths. The antediluvian kings, those who ruled before the Great Flood, are given reign lengths that defy human lifespan. Al-Ulum ruled 28,800 years. Al-Aljar ruled 36,000 years. Enmen-Lu'ana ruled 43,200 years. 8 kings, spanning a total of 241,200 years before the flood came. After the flood, reign lengths drop dramatically, but remain superhuman, 1,200 years, 1,560 years, 900 years. Eventually, the numbers continue to decrease until reaching plausibly human reign lengths for historical kings we can verify through other sources. Scholars generally interpret the fantastical early numbers as mythological exaggeration, perhaps containing some symbolic or mathematical significance, possibly representing dynasties rather than individuals. The list gradually transitions from myth to history, marking the Sumerian understanding of their deep past fading into legend. But there's another way to read it. What if the list is precisely what it appears to be, a chronological record? What if those enormous numbers represent actual measurements of time for beings who existed on a completely different biological timescale than humans? Because here's what's interesting. Even those enormous numbers are still numbers. 28,800 years is a specific, measurable duration. It's not infinity. It's not eternity. It's a very long time, but it's time that can be counted, tracked, and which has an endpoint. If the antediluvian rulers were Anunnaki, and if their lifespans were measured in tens of thousands of years, then they would seem utterly timeless from a human perspective. A being who lived for 28,800 years would appear eternal to humans whose entire civilizations rose and fell in centuries. But measured in tens of thousands of years is still measured. It implies a beginning, and therefore an end. The Sumerians themselves seem to have understood this distinction. Their texts contain a concept they called namti, which translates roughly to life or living. But they also had words that specifically referenced eternity or timelessness, often associated with the cosmic order or with concepts rather than beings. When describing individual Anunnaki, the texts typically use terminology suggesting extended existence rather than eternal existence. This distinction matters, because if the Anunnaki were understood as existing within time, just on a vastly extended scale, then everything about how they interacted with humanity makes more sense. Their need to create humans as a labor force, as described in Atrahasis, stops being capricious divine demand and starts looking like rational problem solving by beings who understood they couldn't physically sustain their civilization's labor requirements forever. Their transmission of knowledge to human priests and scribes becomes not gift but necessity, ensuring their systems would continue functioning after they were gone. The massive architectural projects, the ziggurats and temple complexes, take on a different character. They weren't just houses for eternal gods. They were structures built to last, to preserve, to continue functioning across timescales that dwarfed human planning horizons. They were, perhaps, meant to outlast even their builders. And the Sumerian obsession with writing, with pressing everything into clay, with creating multiple copies of important texts, with maintaining archives that preserved knowledge across centuries, that begins to look less like religious devotion and more like a civilization that understood. Knowledge was fragile. That memory could be lost. That what was known needed to be anchored in physical form, because the minds that held it wouldn't always be present. The relationship between Sumerians and Anunnaki, as described in the texts, wasn't worship from a distance. It was interaction. Administrative interaction. The Anunnaki dwelt in their temples. They required human staff to maintain those structures, to provide food offerings, to perform rituals that, if read literally rather than symbolically, sound remarkably like procedures, specific sequences of actions that needed to be performed correctly to achieve specific results. Human kings received their authority from the Anunnaki. Each city's ruler was installed with divine approval, often depicted in art and described in texts as receiving symbols of kingship directly from their city's patron deity. This wasn't metaphorical, or at least the Sumerians didn't treat it as metaphorical. It was understood as an actual transfer of authority from one category of being to another. with specific ceremonies marking the transition. The oldest legal codes we possess, like the Code of Ur-Nammu from around 2100 BC, explicitly state they were created under divine direction. The law wasn't human invention ratified by gods. It was understood as divine instruction, procedures for organizing human society being conveyed from beings who possessed knowledge of how complex civilizations functioned. All of this could still be mythology. It could be sophisticated cultural framework, the Sumerians projecting authority onto divine beings to legitimize their social structures. That remains the mainstream interpretation, and it's a defensible position. But if we take a step back and look at what the Sumerians actually built, the sudden emergence of urban civilization, advanced mathematics, sophisticated astronomy, complex irrigation systems, standardized writing, organized trade networks spanning thousands of miles, and we look at how they explained it, which was consistent across centuries and cities. The Anunnaki taught us, the Anunnaki established this, the Anunnaki gave us these systems. Then we face a question about the nature of testimony itself. When does a civilization's consistent, detailed, specific account of its own origins merit consideration as something other than pure mythology? The question becomes sharper when we examine texts that describe not the glorious establishment of civilization, but something else. Texts that describe divine vulnerability, divine limitation, divine fear, and in some cases, divine death. Those are the texts we need to examine next, because they're the ones that don't fit neatly into standard mythological frameworks. They're the ones that suggest the Sumerians understood something about the Anunnaki that we've spent centuries dismissing as impossible, that these beings, however powerful, however knowledgeable, however long-lived, were not eternal. They existed within time, which meant time could run out. The language of gods and scribes. Before we can properly evaluate what the Sumerian texts say about divine mortality, we need to understand how we can read those texts at all. The story of cuneiform decipherment is itself a detective story, one that took more than a century to unfold and which fundamentally changed our access to the ancient world. For nearly 2,000 years after the last cuneiform tablets were written, the script was completely illegible. The wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay tablets scattered across Mesopotamia, buried in the ruins of ancient cities, meant nothing to the people who occasionally found them. The knowledge of how to read cuneiform died sometime in the early centuries of the Common Era, as Christianity and Islam replaced the old religions, as Akkadian and Sumerian gave way to Aramaic and Arabic, as the entire framework of ancient Mesopotamian civilization collapsed and was buried under. Centuries of sand and silence. By the time European scholars began seriously investigating the ruins of the Middle East in the 18th and 19th centuries, cuneiform was a complete mystery. Strange angular marks on clay and stone, clearly intentional, obviously writing of some kind, but utterly incomprehensible. Early theories ranged from mere decoration to encoded mystical knowledge. No one had any idea how to approach it. The breakthrough came through Persian royal inscriptions, particularly the massive trilingual inscriptions carved by Darius the Great at Behistun in modern Iran around 520 BCE. The Behistun inscription presented the same text in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Akkadian. Scholars already had some understanding of Old Persian through its relationship to Sanskrit and other Indo-European languages. By working through the Persian text, they could begin to guess at the meanings of the other 2 scripts. The process was painstaking. Georg Friedrich Grotefend made initial progress in 1802, correctly identifying the names of Persian kings in the script. Henry Rawlinson spent years in the 1830s and 1840s making copies of the Behistun inscription, often dangling from ropes on the cliff face to reach the text. Gradually, through decades of work by multiple scholars, the structure of cuneiform became clear. But there was a complication. Multiple complications, actually. First, cuneiform wasn't one writing system, but several. The same set of wedge-shaped marks could represent Akkadian, Assamilic, Sumerian wedge isolate with no known relatives, Elamite, Hittite, and other languages. The signs could work as logograms representing entire word, syllabograms representing lillable, or determinatives indicating the category of word being written. Context-determined meaning. The same cuneiform sign might mean entirely different things depending on what language was being written and where in a word it appeared. Second, Sumerian and Akkadian had been written using the same script for more than 2,000 years, often in the same texts. Later scribes wrote in Akkadian but used Sumerian as a scholarly language, much like medieval Europeans used Latin. Many tablets contain Sumerian text with Akkadian glosses, or Akkadian text quoting Sumerian phrases, or bilingual versions of the same composition. Untangling which language was which and how they related required decades of scholarship. The real explosion in understanding came in the mid-19th century. In 1845, Austin Henry Layard began excavating Nimrud and Nineveh, discovering the palace libraries of Assyrian kings. In 1849, Layard found the palace of Sennacherib at Nineveh. In 1853, Hormuzd Rassam, working at the same site, discovered the library of Ashurbanipal, the last great Assyrian king, who had ruled in the 7th century BC. Ashurbanipal's library was extraordinary. He had systematically collected texts from across Mesopotamia, creating copies of everything from administrative records to literary epics, from astronomical observations to medical texts. When the palace burned during the fall of Nineveh in 6112 BC, the fire baked the clay tablets, essentially firing them like pottery and preserving them for millennia. Rassam's excavations recovered more than 30,000 tablets and fragments. Those tablets were shipped to the British Museum, where they languished in storage for years. There simply weren't enough scholars who could read them. But gradually, translators began working through the material. And on November 3rd, 1872, George Smith stood before the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London and read his translation of a tablet that would change everything. The tablet, catalogued as K3375 and later designated as Tablet C of the Epic of Gilgamesh, contained an account of a great flood. A god warned a man to build a boat and load it with living creatures. The flood came, destroying humanity. The waters receded, the boat grounded on a mountain, birds were sent out to test for dry land. The parallels to the biblical Noah story were unmistakable, but this text predated the composition of Genesis by more than 1,000 years. The implications reverberated through Victorian scholarship. Here was proof that biblical narratives had earlier antecedents in Mesopotamian literature. The Bible wasn't recording unique, divinely revealed history. It was drawing on older traditions, adapting and reinterpreting stories that had circulated in the ancient Near East for millennia before Hebrew scribes put them to parchment. Smith's discovery electrified public interest in cuneiform studies. Newspapers covered the finding. The Daily Telegraph funded an expedition for Smith to return to Nineveh to search for missing portions of the tablet. He found them, remarkably, within days of beginning excavations. The field of Assyriology expanded rapidly as more scholars learned to read the ancient scripts and more tablets were excavated from Mesopotamian sites. By the early 20th century, the major features of Sumerian and Akkadian grammar had been established. Dictionaries were compiled. The vast majority of known literary compositions had been translated, at least in preliminary form, but significant challenges remained, and remain to this day. The first challenge is damage. Most tablets are fragmentary. Even relatively complete tablets often have sections missing, chunks broken off, surfaces eroded. The clay survives remarkably well when baked or in dry conditions, but millennia of burial take their toll. Translators must work with partial texts, reconstructing meaning from context and comparing multiple fragmentary copies of the same composition when available. The second challenge is vocabulary. We don't have native speakers to consult. Our understanding of Sumerian and Akkadian comes entirely from the texts themselves and from ancient bilingual dictionaries and lexical lists compiled by Mesopotamian scribes. For common words, we're reasonably confident. For rare terms, technical vocabulary, or words that appear only once or twice in the entire corpus, we're often guessing based on context. The third challenge is conceptual. When translating terms like dinger, namti, kur, inner world / mountain / foreign land, me, power / attribute, we're mapping Mesopotamian concepts onto English words that carry different philosophical baggage. The Sumerian dinger doesn't mean quite the same thing as the English God, with its accumulated centuries of Judeo-Christian theological nuance. But we use God because it's the closest available translation, while acknowledging the fit is imperfect. This matters enormously when we're trying to evaluate what Sumerian texts say about the nature and mortality of the Anunnaki, because the question hinges on precise terminology, on understanding exactly what words the scribes chose and what conceptual distinctions they were making. For example, the Sumerian language had multiple words relating to death and dying. Ug meant death in the sense of being dead, the state of death. Ush meant to die, the act of dying. Ug meant to die specifically for humans. But there were other terms used in contexts involving divine beings that scholars translate variously as to vanish, to disappear, to descend, to go away, terms that might refer to death or to some other kind of departure or transition. When texts describe Dumuzi's fate, they use terminology that mainstream scholarship interprets as mythological death, representing seasonal cycles, the vegetation god who dies and is reborn. But the actual Sumerian words employed are the same ones used for human death in other contexts. The texts describe his body being seized, his flesh being torn, his spirit descending to the underworld. The procedures described are specific, detailed, and not obviously metaphorical. Similarly, when texts describe gods being wounded in battle, requiring healing, needing rejuvenation, the Sumerian employs concrete physical terminology. Bodies that can be cut bleed. Flesh that ages requires restoration. These aren't abstract concepts. They're descriptions using the same physical vocabulary applied to human bodies and human medicine. The academic response to this has generally been to maintain that it's all symbolic. The gods have bodies in the mythology, because the Sumerians thought in anthropomorphic terms, projecting human characteristics onto divine forces. The deaths and injuries are narrative devices, dramatic elements in stories that encode seasonal, political, or cosmic cycles. This interpretation is reasonable and defensible. Ancient mythologies worldwide featured gods who experienced things that gods, logically, shouldn't experience. Thor can be poisoned by the Midgard serpent's venom despite being a god. Osiris can be killed and dismembered despite being immortal. The presence of divine vulnerability in mythology is common and doesn't necessarily indicate the cultures who produced those myths believed their gods were literally mortal. But the Sumerian approach to describing all of this is notably unromantic. When the Atrahasis epic describes the gods toiling in exhausting labor before creating humans, it doesn't use elevated poetic language. It uses administrative terminology. The gods are performing work. The work is exhausting. They require relief. The solution is to create a labor force. The text reads like a management memo, justifying a workforce expansion, not like mystical poetry about cosmic cycles. When medical texts describe procedures for divine healing, they don't frame it as metaphor. They provide what read like instructions: specific substances, specific procedures, specific expected outcomes. These texts sit in archives alongside human medical texts, differentiated primarily by the patient being divine rather than human, but using the same medical vocabulary and procedural framework. When king lists record divine or semi-divine rulers with specific reign lengths measured in years, very large numbers of years, but specific numbers nonetheless, they employ the same chronological precision used for fully historical kings later in the same lists. The text doesn't signal a genre shift. It treats the entire chronology as continuous information, ancient times flowing into historical times with no marker distinguishing mythology from history. This creates a translation problem that's also an interpretation problem. When we translate these texts into English, we make choices about how to render ambiguous terms. Those choices embed interpretation into the translation itself. If we translate a term as the god disappeared versus the god died, we're already deciding whether divine mortality is possible in the text. If we translate measurements of divine lifespans as mythological prehistory versus antediluvian chronology, we're deciding whether the numbers are meant to be taken as real measurements or symbolic. Modern critical translation tries to preserve ambiguity where it exists in the original. But popular summaries and retellings tend to smooth over the ambiguity, defaulting to standard mythological interpretations because those are familiar and expected. The result is that most people who encounter Sumerian mythology encounter it in a form that's already been interpreted as mythology, with the rough edges filed off, the strange specificities explained away, the procedural language converted into poetic narrative. But those rough edges are where the interesting information lives. In the 1920s and 1930s, Samuel Noah Kramer at the University of Pennsylvania began systematically working through the Sumerian literary texts in the Penn Museum's massive collection of tablets from Nippur. Kramer spent decades piecing together fragmentary tablets, identifying duplicate copies of the same compositions, and producing authoritative translations. His work revealed the scope and sophistication of Sumerian literature, including extensive mythological cycles that predated and influenced Babylonian versions. Kramer's translations became standard references. But Kramer himself noted peculiarities in how the Sumerian texts treated their deities. The gods in these early compositions seemed more physical, more limited, more embedded in the material world than the more elevated deities of later Babylonian theology. Kramer attributed this to early developmental stages in religious thinking, primitive anthropomorphism giving way to more sophisticated abstract theology over time. But there's another possible explanation. What if the earlier texts preserved a memory of something real, and later theology elevated and abstracted that memory into standard divine immortality? What if the progression wasn't primitive to sophisticated, but specific to general, detailed knowledge gradually fading into mythological framework as direct contact with the Anunnaki ended, and humans were left working from incomplete memory? The texts themselves can't answer that question definitively. Translation can give us access to what the words say, but not to absolute certainty about what the scribes meant or what reality those words described. We're left evaluating probabilities, weighing interpretations, deciding which reading makes more sense of the evidence. What we can say with certainty is this: the Sumerian texts contain detailed, specific, procedural descriptions of divine beings experiencing things that immortal beings shouldn't experience. Fatigue, injury, aging, need for restoration, fear, and in multiple texts across different time periods and different cities, descriptions of divine beings dying, or at minimum, transitioning to states that are functionally indistinguishable from death. Those descriptions exist. They're not ambiguous on whether the events happened. The texts clearly present them as events that occurred. The ambiguity is whether we should read those events as literally as the texts present them, or whether we should interpret them through a mythological framework that assumes divine immortality and therefore recasts everything as symbolic. For the next several chapters, we're going to look at specific texts and what they actually say, not what scholars have interpreted them to mean, but what the Sumerian and Akkadian words themselves convey. We'll start with the text that most explicitly addresses divine vulnerability, the Atrahasis epic, which describes gods being pushed to their breaking point. When gods toiled and rebelled. The Atrahasis epic exists in multiple versions, spanning more than a millennium of Mesopotamian literary tradition. The most complete text comes from the Old Babylonian period, around 1700 BC, but the story itself is older, with Sumerian antecedents that likely date back to the 3rd millennium. Fragments of the epic have been found at multiple sites, Nineveh, Ashur, Kish, indicating it was widely known and copied across Mesopotamian civilization. The title Atrahasis means exceedingly wise in Akkadian, referring to the flood hero who survives the divine destruction of humanity. But the epic isn't primarily a flood story. The flood occupies only the final third of the composition. The first 2/3 describe something else: the creation of humanity, the reason humanity exists, and the relationship between humans and gods that makes civilization possible. And it begins with gods doing hard labor. The text opens before humanity exists. The great gods have divided cosmic responsibilities among themselves, establishing an administrative hierarchy. The Anunnaki, the great gods, hold the positions of authority, but there are also the Igigi, described as younger gods or lesser gods, and to them falls the actual physical work of maintaining cosmic order, specifically their digging. The text is explicit about this. The Igigi are assigned to excavate river channels, to dig out the beds of the Tigris and Euphrates, to create the irrigation networks that will make Mesopotamian agriculture possible. This is backbreaking work. The text describes them laboring for 40 years, digging, carrying baskets of earth, building embankments. The passage uses terminology that appears elsewhere in administrative texts describing human labor. Gangs performing exactly this kind of work. After 40 years, the Igigi have had enough. The text describes them as weary, exhausted, burdened beyond endurance. They complain among themselves. The work is too much. The greater gods sit in comfort while they perform endless, crushing labor. Something has to change, and so they rebel. The rebellion is described in terms that should be impossible for immortal divine beings. They burn their tools. They march at night to the dwelling of Enlil, the chief administrator among the Anunnaki. They surround his residence and demand to speak with him. Enlil, alarmed, summons the other great gods. What is the meaning of this uprising? Who is responsible? The Igigi present their case. The labor is killing them. That's the term the Akkadian uses. Language of being killed, destroyed, unable to continue. They cannot sustain this work any longer. Either the conditions must change, or they will cease to function. Note what's happening here. Divine beings are describing physical limitation. They're experiencing exhaustion that compromises their ability to work. They're in a position where continued labor would destroy them. These are not characteristics of immortal, omnipotent deities. These are characteristics of physical beings with finite energy and breaking points. Enlil is angry. He views this as insubordination, a challenge to established order. He wants to punish the rebels. But Enki, god of wisdom and technical knowledge, proposes a different solution. If the Igigi cannot sustain the necessary labor, then create something else that can. Create a being capable of performing the work, intelligent enough to follow instructions but subordinate to divine authority. Create humans. The text then provides a detailed account of human creation. It's not metaphorical, it's procedural. Enki provides specifications. They will need a goddess to oversee the birth process, Ninhursag, called Belet Eli in Akkadian, is summoned. They will need raw materials. The gods slaughter one of the Igigi rebels, specifically a god described as having reason or personality, and mix his blood and flesh with clay. The text is specific about why they use divine material. They need humans to possess enough intelligence to perform complex tasks, to understand instructions, to function as effective labor. Pure clay wouldn't suffice. Divine essence mixed with earthly material produces beings who are capable of the required work while remaining distinctly subordinate to the gods who created them. Ninhursag shapes the mixture. 14 birth goddesses are assembled, 7 for male humans and 7 for female. The process is completed. Humans come into existence. The text describes Enki as pleased with his solution. The Igigi are relieved of their crushing labor. Humans take over the work of digging canals, building irrigation systems, cultivating fields, and maintaining the physical infrastructure of civilization. This account appears in multiple Mesopotamian texts, with variations but consistent core elements. The gods needed labor performed. They created humans to perform it. Humanity's fundamental purpose in Sumerian and Babylonian cosmology was to serve as the workforce that maintained civilization on behalf of beings who couldn't or wouldn't perform that labor themselves. Now, standard mythological interpretation treats this as allegory. The story encodes understanding about the relationship between humans and divine forces, about humanity's place in cosmic order, about the origins of civilization and why humans work. The labor is metaphorical, representing perhaps agricultural cycles or natural processes. The gods are personifications of forces or social structures. It's a mythological explanation for why humans must labor to survive. But read literally, the text describes something else. It describes beings with physical limitations creating a subordinate workforce because they couldn't physically sustain the necessary labor themselves. It describes divine beings who can be exhausted, who can be killed, who can suffer, who can rebel. It describes a practical problem, insufficient labor capacity, being solved through what reads like genetic engineering, mixing biological material from the gods themselves with earthly matter to produce hybrid beings with the required characteristics. And then the text continues to what mainstream scholarship focuses on: the flood. After humans are created, they multiply rapidly. Within a few generations, humanity spreads across Mesopotamia, cities arise, population grows, and the noise increases. This is a detail that puzzles modern readers. Humanity is destroyed not for wickedness, but for noise. The text describes the clamor of human civilization becoming so loud, so constant, that Enlil cannot sleep. Enlil decides to reduce the human population. First, he tries plague. The plague kills many humans, but not enough. Population recovers. Then he tries drought and famine. Again, humans suffer but survive. Each time, Enki intervenes, providing humans with knowledge to survive the catastrophe. Finally, Enlil proposes the ultimate solution, a flood to completely wipe out humanity. The decision is described as being made in divine council. The great gods, Enlil, Enki, Ninhursag, meet to discuss the problem. They take an oath to proceed with the flood, binding themselves to secrecy so humans won't have warning. But Enki, who had designed humans in the first place, doesn't want to see his creation completely destroyed. He can't directly warn humans without breaking his oath. So he speaks to the reed wall of Atrahasis' house, technically addressing the wall rather than the human, and instructs Atrahasis to build a boat. The instructions are precise: dimensions for the vessel, design specifications, what materials to use, how to seal it against water, what provisions to load. Atrahasis is to bring aboard his family, animals, seeds, everything necessary to preserve life through the catastrophe. Atrahasis builds the boat. The flood comes. The text describes it in vivid terms: 7 days and nights of devastating rain, storm surge overwhelming the land, water covering even the mountains. The destruction is total. Everyone outside the boat perishes. And here's where the text provides a detail that's absolutely crucial for our investigation. When the flood comes and humans begin dying, the gods react. The text describes them as horrified by what they've done. They huddle together like frightened animals. They weep. The birth goddesses lament the destruction, and most tellingly, they realize too late that they've made a catastrophic error. Who will provide food offerings now? Who will maintain the temples? Who will perform the labor that keeps civilization functioning? The text explicitly states that the gods go hungry. Without humans to provide offerings, they lack sustenance. After 7 days of flood, the gods are described as desperate, starving, and deeply regretting the decision to destroy humanity. This should not be possible for immortal, self-sufficient deities. Gods who are truly eternal and omnipotent don't require food from humans. They don't starve. They don't make decisions they regret when consequences become clear. They don't huddle together in fear during a storm they themselves created. But the gods in Atrahasis do all of these things. When the waters recede and Atrahasis emerges from the boat and makes a sacrifice, slaughtering animals and burning offerings, the text says the gods gathered like flies around the sacrifice. They're famished. They need the food. Enlil is initially furious that a human survived, but the other gods are so relieved to have humans again that they override his anger. Enki points out the practicality. Complete destruction was a mistake. They need humans. The solution is to limit human population through other means: higher infant mortality, women who don't bear children, natural deaths, rather than complete annihilation. The epic ends with this new arrangement in place. Humans will continue to exist, but with natural checks on population growth. The noise problem will be managed. The gods will continue to receive the labor and offerings they require. Balance is restored. Read as mythology. Atrahasis encodes sophisticated thinking about human-divine relationships, about limits of power, about the interdependence between worshippers and worshipped. It's a rich text that invites multiple layers of interpretation. But read literally, it describes something extraordinary: beings of immense power and knowledge who nonetheless operate under physical constraints, who require labor to be performed and lack the capacity to perform it indefinitely themselves, who need sustenance, who can make errors in judgment, who experience fear, who can be bound by oaths and agreements, who are capable of destroying humanity but discover they can't afford to because they need what humanity provides. These are not attributes of omnipotent, immortal deities. These are attributes of powerful but finite beings managing a complex civilization they can't maintain alone. The text was widely copied and referenced throughout Mesopotamian history. It wasn't obscure or marginal. It was part of the core literary tradition. Scribes in multiple cities across more than 1,000 years carefully preserved this account, making new copies when old tablets deteriorated, including it in library collections as essential knowledge. What were they preserving? A sophisticated creation myth or an account of actual events, understood by the Sumerians and Babylonians to be their civilization's true history? The text itself doesn't signal that it's metaphorical. It presents the account in the same matter-of-fact style used for historical chronicles and administrative records. It provides specific details: 40 years of labor, 7 days of flood, dimensional specifications for the ark. It describes cause and effect in practical terms. We need labor, we create laborers, we destroy laborers, we lose the benefits they provided. And crucially, it describes gods who can die. Because when they slaughter the rebel Ijiji to obtain his blood and flesh for mixing with clay, that God doesn't merely vanish or relocate to another realm. The text uses terminology indicating permanent death, that God's existence ends. His physical substance is repurposed. He ceases to be. If one God can die, then gods are mortal. The category might have vastly extended lifespans, might possess capabilities humans lack, might operate on a completely different scale of existence, but mortality remains possible. Death remains real. The implications ripple through everything else in Mesopotamian literature, because once we understand that divine mortality was conceptually possible within the Sumerian worldview, we have to reread every other text that describes gods dying, disappearing, being imprisoned, requiring healing, or being transformed. These stop being impossible events that must be interpreted as pure metaphor. They become events the Sumerians might have understood as literally true, and no text illustrates this more clearly than the death of Dumuzi, which stands as perhaps the most explicit account of divine mortality in the entire Mesopotamian corpus. The death that shook the heavens. There exists in Sumerian literature a cycle of texts that describe an event so catastrophic, so fundamentally disruptive to cosmic order, that its reverberations echo through multiple compositions spanning centuries. These texts don't speak in metaphor or allegory. They describe, in concrete physical terms, the death of a god. His name was Dumuzi. In Akkadian sources, he's called Tammuz. He was the divine shepherd, the consort of Inanna, goddess of war and love, and his death is recorded with a specificity that resists easy mythological interpretation. The primary sources for Dumuzi's death include several interconnected compositions. Inanna's descent to the underworld, cataloged as ETCSL 1.4.1 in the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, exists in multiple Old Babylonian copies from sites including Nippur and Ur. Dumuzi's dream, a separate composition, describes the events leading to his death from his own perspective. And Dumuzi and the Gala details his actual capture and demise. These aren't different versions of the same story, they're complementary texts describing different phases of the same sequence of events. The narrative begins with Inanna's decision to descend to the underworld, the realm ruled by her sister Ereshkigal. The text is explicit about Inanna's motivation. She wants to expand her power, to add dominion over the dead to her already considerable authority over the living. She dresses in her most powerful regalia, the crown of the steppe, the measuring rod and line, the beads and stones that symbolize and perhaps literally convey specific aspects of her power. Before descending, Inanna instructs her servant Ninshubur on exactly what to do if she doesn't return. The precautions are detailed and specific, suggesting Inanna understands this is genuinely dangerous. She's not being metaphorical about the risks. She's giving contingency instructions in case something goes permanently wrong. Inanna descends through the 7 gates of the underworld. At each gate, the gatekeeper Neti, acting on Ereshkigal's orders, forces her to remove one piece of her regalia. One by one, the symbols and sources of her power are stripped away. By the time she reaches the throne room, she stands naked and powerless before her sister. The 7 judges of the underworld, the Anunna, a council of underworld deities, fix their eyes upon her. Their gaze is described in terms that suggest it's not merely metaphorical looking. The text uses language indicating a tangible effect. Their judgment is rendered guilty, and Inanna dies. The text doesn't say she seemed to die or entered a death-like state. It says she died. Her corpse is described as a piece of rotting meat hung on a hook on the wall. 3 days and 3 nights pass with Inanna dead in the underworld. Meanwhile, on the surface, Ninshubur waits the agreed-upon time, and then begins executing Inanna's contingency plan. She goes to the temples of the great gods, tearing at her hair, wearing mourning clothes, pleading for someone to intervene. Enlil refuses. Inanna chose to descend. She must face the consequences. Nana, the moon god, refuses on the same grounds. But Enki, god of wisdom, agrees to help. Enki creates two beings from the dirt under his fingernails. He gives them specific instructions and equips them with the food of life and the water of life. These substances are described in terms that suggest they're tangible things, not abstract concepts. The two beings descend to the underworld, find Inanna's corpse, and apply the food and water of life. Inanna revives. She prepares to return to the surface. But there's a rule. No one who enters the underworld can leave without providing a substitute. Someone must take Inanna's place in the realm of the dead. The Gala demons, underworld enforcers, accompany Inanna back to the surface to ensure she provides a replacement. She passes various gods and servants, all of whom are properly dressed in mourning for her death. She spares each of them. But when she reaches her own city of Uruk and finds Dumuzi sitting on her throne, dressed in fine garments, not mourning at all, her rage is absolute. The text describes her anger in visceral terms. Dumuzi, her consort, should have been devastated by her death. Instead, he appears to have used her absence to elevate himself, to take her position, to enjoy the prerogatives of her power. Inanna's judgment is immediate. She points at Dumuzi and tells the Gala, "Take him." What follows is described in multiple texts with variations but consistent core details. Dumuzi flees. He runs from the Gala demons, trying desperately to escape. He prays to Utu, the sun god, his brother-in-law, begging for help. Utu transforms Dumuzi's hands into snake hands, his feet into snake feet, allowing him to move faster, to hide in places the Gala can't reach. But it only delays the inevitable. The text called Dumuzi's Dream describes the night before his capture. Dumuzi has a nightmare, a prophetic vision of his own death. He sees symbols of destruction, his shepherd's staff broken, his cup shattered, his churn overturned. He sees eagles carrying off lambs, representing predators seizing vulnerable prey. He tells his sister Geshtinana about the dream, and she interprets it, "The Gala are coming. You will die." Dumuzi tries to hide. Geshtinana helps him, refusing to reveal his location even under torture from the Gala. But eventually, through the betrayal of Dumuzi's friend, the Gala discover his hiding place. They seize him. And the text describes what happens next in terms that are difficult to dismiss as purely symbolic. The Gala strike Dumuzi on the cheek. They pour milk from his churn onto the ground. They treat his body violently, causing physical harm. Dumuzi's death is described using the same Sumerian terminology that appears in texts describing human death, Ugh, the state of being dead, and Ush, the act of dying. His body is described as being torn, damaged, destroyed. His spirit descends to the underworld, taking Inanna's place as a prisoner in the realm of death. Geshtinana mourns. The text describes her lament in detail, and it's not abstract, metaphorical grief. She describes her brother's physical body suffering physical harm. She describes the place where he was killed. She describes his absence as permanent loss, not temporary departure. But then the texts introduce a complication. Some versions describe a compromise brokered among the gods. Dumuzi will spend half the year in the underworld, and his sister Geshtinana will spend the other half in his place, allowing him to return to the surface for 6 months annually. This arrangement gives rise to the standard scholarly interpretation. Dumuzi is a vegetation deity. His death and resurrection represent the seasonal cycle. His 6 months in the underworld correspond to the hot, dry summer when plants die, and his return corresponds to the growing season. This interpretation is tidy. It fits established patterns of agricultural mythology found in multiple cultures. The dying and reviving god is a common motif. Osiris in Egypt, Adonis in Greece, Attis in Phrygia. The pattern recurs because it maps onto observable natural cycles. Dumuzi fits the pattern. Case closed. Except the Sumerian texts don't treat it as metaphor. When later Babylonian and Assyrian texts reference Dumuzi's death, they treat it as an event in cosmic history, something that happened and had consequences. The mourning rituals performed for Dumuzi in Mesopotamian cities weren't symbolic expressions of agricultural anxiety. They were understood as commemorations of an actual death, ceremonies that connected human worshippers to a tragic event in divine history. The biblical prophet Ezekiel, writing in the 6th century BC during the Babylonian exile, describes with horror seeing women at the temple in Jerusalem weeping for Tammuz. Ezekiel 8:14. This was understood as apostasy, participation in pagan mourning rituals for a foreign god. But the women weren't performing abstract seasonal ceremonies. They were grieving someone they understood to have actually died. The Roman historian Lucian, writing in the 2nd century CE, describes the annual festival of Adonis, the Greek name for the same deity, in which devotees reenacted his death with genuine mourning, followed by celebration of his return to life. He presents this not as abstract seasonal ritual, but as commemoration of events believers understood to be real. The Dumuzi tradition persisted for more than 3,000 years across multiple cultures, always with the same core understanding: this being died, it was a tragedy, and the death was commemorated because it mattered. Now the seasonal interpretation remains viable. The death and return cycle maps perfectly onto agricultural patterns. The timing of Mesopotamian festivals associated with Dumuzi aligns with planting and harvest seasons. The symbolic framework makes sense. But there's another reading. What if Dumuzi was a real being, one of the Anunnaki, semi-divine or fully divine, who actually died? What if the event was so unprecedented, so shocking to Mesopotamian civilization, that it became the template for understanding seasonal cycles? Not the cycle creating the myth, but the historical death being mapped onto the cycle as a way to process and ritualize the trauma. If the Anunnaki were understood as vulnerable to death, but expected to have extremely long lifespans, then the unexpected death of one would be profoundly disruptive. It would require explanation, ritual response, and integration into cosmic order. The compromise that has Dumuzi spending half the year in the underworld could be literal description of his state, not fully destroyed, not accessible to the living, but existing in some liminal space associated with the realm of the dead. The Sumerian concept of the underworld wasn't quite the same as later conceptions of hell or even the Greek Hades. The the underworld, was described as a dark, dreary place where the dead existed in diminished form, not torment, but also not cessation, a kind of continued existence in shadow, cut off from the living world, trapped in a space from which escape was normally impossible. If Dumuzi was trapped there, existing but inaccessible, unable to return permanently but also not completely annihilated, that would explain the compromise described in the texts. He's not resurrected in the sense of returning to full life. He's permitted temporary release, a cyclical reprieve from underworld imprisonment, but he always returns to that realm. His death was real. Its reversal was only partial. This reading has profound implications. Because if Dumuzi could die, if a consort of Inanna, a god with his own temples and worshippers and specific cosmic responsibilities, could be killed and consigned to the underworld, then divine mortality wasn't hypothetical. It was demonstrated. Every other member of the Anunnaki would have seen it happen. They would have understood that death was possible for them too. The texts that describe other gods' reactions to Dumuzi's death support this reading. There's genuine grief, genuine shock, not symbolic seasonal sadness, but what reads as authentic mourning for a permanent loss. Inanna herself is described as overcome with regret after condemning Dumuzi, suggesting the death was more absolute, more irreversible than she anticipated when she pointed the Gala toward him in her anger. And there are other texts, usually interpreted as mythological variations, that describe attempts to retrieve Dumuzi from the underworld to somehow reverse or mitigate his death. These aren't successful. He remains in the underworld, accessible only during his periodic releases, never fully restored to his former existence. If the Anunnaki witnessed one of their own permanently die, or at minimum become permanently diminished, trapped in the underworld, reduced from full divine status to something less, that knowledge would fundamentally alter their self-understanding. They would know with certainty that they were not eternal, that their existence could end. That death was real for them, not merely something that happened to humans. This brings us back to the question that opened this investigation. If the Sumerians knew the Anunnaki were not immortal, if they had seen at least one Anunnaki die, how would that change their entire civilization's understanding of itself, of its gods, and of the relationship between the two? It would explain the desperate quest that drives the most famous Mesopotamian narrative, the Epic of Gilgamesh, because Gilgamesh isn't just any human seeking immortality. He's partly divine himself, and his quest takes on completely different meaning if divine nature doesn't automatically confer eternal life. Gilgamesh and the Failed Quest. The Epic of Gilgamesh is perhaps the most famous literary work to survive from ancient Mesopotamia. It exists in multiple versions, Sumerian fragments, an Old Babylonian version, and the most complete Standard Babylonian version found in Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh. The story of Gilgamesh and his quest for immortality has been translated into dozens of modern languages and adapted into countless retellings. It's often presented as humanity's first great meditation on mortality, a poetic exploration of the inevitability of death. But there's a detail at the heart of the epic that complicates this reading. Gilgamesh isn't fully human. The text is explicit about this. He is 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. His mother is Ninsun, a goddess. His father is Lugobanda, a semi-divine king, who appears in earlier Sumerian epic cycles. Gilgamesh himself is described as having divine attributes, extraordinary strength, superhuman endurance, and a lifespan that far exceeds normal human limits. So when Gilgamesh desperately seeks immortality, when he undertakes an impossible journey to find the one human who achieved eternal life, when he risks everything to obtain a plant that can restore youth, why? If divinity confers immortality, if his divine nature makes him fundamentally different from mortals, why does he fear death? Why does he believe death is possible for him? The epic begins in Uruk, the city Gilgamesh rules. The text describes him as an oppressive king, so powerful and energetic that he exhausts his people. He takes every young man for forced labor, claims every bride on her wedding night, and allows no one rest. The people of Uruk cry out to the gods for relief. The gods create Enkidu as a match for Gilgamesh, a wild man raised among animals, living in the steppe, as strong as Gilgamesh himself. After Enkidu is civilized and brought to the city, He and Gilgamesh fight, recognize each other as equals, and become inseparable friends. Together they undertake adventures. They journey to the cedar forest to slay Humbaba, the monstrous guardian appointed by Enlil to protect the sacred trees. They return victorious. Inanna offers to marry Gilgamesh, but he refuses, citing her history of destroying previous lovers. Enraged, Inanna sends the bull of heaven to attack Uruk. Gilgamesh and Enkidu kill the bull, but this victory has consequences. The gods meet in council and decide that killing Humbaba and the bull of heaven requires punishment. One of the two heroes must die. They choose Enkidu. Enkidu falls ill. The text describes his illness in detail: fever, weakness, gradual deterioration over 12 days. He has prophetic dreams of the underworld, visions of being seized and dragged down to the dark realm of the dead. And then, on the 12th day, Enkidu dies. Gilgamesh's grief is overwhelming. The text describes him refusing to believe Enkidu is dead, sitting beside the corpse for 7 days and nights, until maggots begin falling from the body. Only then does Gilgamesh accept that his friend is truly gone, and this is where Gilgamesh's quest begins. Not from philosophical contemplation of mortality's inevitability, but from direct confrontation with death's reality. His friend, who was as strong as him, as extraordinary, as seemingly invulnerable, is dead. And if Enkidu could die, then Gilgamesh can die too. The realization terrifies him. Gilgamesh abandons his kingship and sets out on a desperate journey to find Utnapishtim, the survivor of the Great Flood, whom the gods granted immortality after the deluge. If Gilgamesh can reach Utnapishtim and learn how he achieved eternal life, perhaps Gilgamesh can do the same. Perhaps death can be escaped. The journey takes Gilgamesh to the edge of the world. He passes through mountains where the sun rises, encountering scorpion people who guard the gate. He crosses the waters of death, the impassable sea that separates the mortal world from the realm where Utnapishtim dwells. Finally, he reaches Utnapishtim and demands to know, "How did you escape death?" Utnapishtim's answer is disappointing. He didn't earn immortality through heroic deeds or secret knowledge. He was simply the human chosen to survive the flood. After the waters receded and he made sacrifice, the gods, feeling guilty about nearly destroying all humanity, granted him and his wife eternal life as compensation. It was a unique circumstance, a one-time decision made in the aftermath of cosmic catastrophe. The path isn't replicable. There's no method Gilgamesh can follow. But then Utnapishtim offers something else. He tells Gilgamesh about a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea. This plant doesn't grant immortality, but it restores youth. Its name translates as "old man becomes young man," or "the old man will be young again." If Gilgamesh can obtain this plant, he can at least continually restore his youth, extending his life indefinitely, even if true immortality remains out of reach. Gilgamesh dives to the bottom of the sea. The text describes him tying stones to his feet to sink into the depths, a detail that suggests the tradition-preserved memory of actual diving techniques. He finds the plant. He obtains it. He begins the journey back to Uruk, planning to test the plant on an old man in his city before using it himself. But while Gilgamesh stops to bathe in a pool, a serpent smells the plant, emerges from the water, and steals it. The serpent eats the plant and immediately sheds its skin, becoming young again. Gilgamesh returns to find the plant gone. He sits down and weeps. Everything he risked, everything he endured, all the impossible barriers he crossed, meaningless. The plant is lost. death remains inevitable. The epic ends with Gilgamesh returning to Uruk, accepting his mortality, and focusing on the immortality that is available to humans, the immortality of legacy of great works that outlast individual lives. The walls of Uruk will stand for generations. His name will be remembered. That will have to be enough. It's a powerful story, and the standard interpretation is that it's fundamentally about human mortality. Gilgamesh must learn to accept death as the inevitable end of all mortal creatures. His divine ancestry doesn't exempt him because he's still part human, and the human part makes him mortal. The story teaches acceptance of limits, but this interpretation requires us to accept that Gilgamesh's partly divine nature is irrelevant to his mortality. That divine ancestry provides strength and abilities, but not extended lifespan or freedom from death. Yet other texts contradict this. The Sumerian king list describes Gilgamesh ruling Uruk for 126 years, an impossible human lifespan, but perhaps reasonable for a semi-divine being. Earlier Sumerian texts describe him traveling to the underworld after death and taking on administrative functions there, suggesting some kind of continued existence beyond mortal death. What if Gilgamesh's quest reflects a different anxiety? What if, as a semi-divine being, he expected to have an extraordinarily long lifespan, thousands of years perhaps, like the antediluvian kings, but not true immortality? What if he understood that his divine nature gave him extended life, but not eternal life, and Enkidu's death forced him to confront the reality that his time, too, was ultimately finite? This reading makes Utnapishtim's story more relevant, because Utnapishtim is fully human, yet the gods granted him immortality, which means immortality wasn't an inherent quality of divinity. It was something that could be granted, transferred, obtained through specific circumstances. If humans could achieve it under certain conditions, and if some gods could die as Dumuzi had, then immortality wasn't a category distinction between divine and human. It was a state that some possessed and others lacked, regardless of their origin. The plant at the bottom of the sea takes on new significance in this reading. It wasn't mythological symbol. It was something the Mesopotamian tradition believed actually existed, a substance perhaps biological, perhaps technological, that could restore youth and by extension delay death. The specificity of the description suggests memory of something real, a plant or something plant-like, growing in a specific location with measurable effects. The fact that a serpent stole it and shed its skin afterward connects to observed biology. Snakes do shed their skin and appear renewed. If someone observed this and extrapolated that snakes had access to rejuvenating substance, the story makes sense as interpretation of natural phenomena. But alternatively, if there was an actual rejuvenating substance that serpents, or something serpent-related, could access or had affinity with, the story preserves memory of that reality. Gilgamesh's failure to secure the plant might record an actual historical failure, a semi-divine king who sought the same rejuvenation technology the Anunnaki used to extend their lifespans, but was unable to obtain it permanently. His quest would then be not philosophical meditation, but practical attempt to secure physical longevity technology. Throughout the epic, Gilgamesh encounters divine beings, and his interactions with them are telling. When he meets Siduri, the divine tavern keeper at the edge of the world, she advises him to give up his quest and accept mortality. When he meets Utnapishtim, the immortal human tells him there's no path to eternal life. Neither of them says you're partly divine, so you'll naturally live much longer than humans. They speak to him as though he faces the same mortality as any other mortal creature. This suggests that in the understanding of the epic's composers, divine ancestry didn't automatically confer immunity to death. It provided advantages, strength, abilities, possibly extended lifespan, but not freedom from mortality's ultimate claim. The historical Gilgamesh was a real king who ruled Uruk sometime around 2600 BCE. His tomb was reportedly discovered in 2003 when a German archaeological team found evidence of a burial beneath the former course of the Euphrates River, matching descriptions from ancient texts. Contemporary documents from his era mention him as a historical ruler. Over the following centuries, stories about his reign accumulated, were embellished, transformed into epic narrative, and preserved in multiple versions across more than 2,000 years. The core of the story, a partly divine king who sought immortality and failed to achieve it, likely preserves memory of something real. Perhaps not the specific adventures as narrated, which accumulated legendary elements over time, but the central fact: Gilgamesh feared death, sought to escape it, and failed. If the Anunnaki were mortal, if even divine beings faced death, then Gilgamesh's anxiety makes perfect sense. He was partly divine, which gave him extraordinary capabilities and probably an extended lifespan, but he knew that divine nature didn't guarantee eternal existence. He had possibly witnessed divine deaths, or heard accounts of them, like Dumuzi's death. He understood that time would eventually run out. His desperate quest to find a way around mortality reflects the anxiety of a being who expected to live longer than humans, but who knew that longer wasn't forever. And the plant he briefly obtained, the rejuvenation technology that could restore youth, suggests the Anunnaki themselves used something similar, not because they were immortal, but because they needed methods to extend their lifespans, to restore youth periodically, to delay the inevitable end. Which brings us to the next question. What do the texts tell us about divine rejuvenation, about the procedures and substances the Anunnaki used to maintain themselves, about the me, those divine powers that could be transferred, stolen, or lost? Because if the gods required rejuvenation, required healing, required specific substances to maintain their existence, then they were biological beings operating under constraints, not eternal, immaterial deities. And the texts describe exactly that, the rejuvenation problem. Among the vast corpus of Sumerian texts cataloged and translated over the past century and a half, there exists a category that scholars classify as medical and magical literature. These texts include diagnoses, treatments, incantations for healing, and prescriptions for both human and divine patients. The fact that divine healing texts exist is itself significant. Why would immortal, invulnerable gods require medical intervention? The standard academic explanation is that these texts are entirely ritual and symbolic. When a deity's cult statue was damaged or its temple fell into disrepair, priests performed ceremonies described as healing the god. The medical language is metaphorical, referring to restoration of the god's honor and cult presence, not literal treatment of a divine body. This interpretation is defensible for many texts, but there are others that resist easy categorization as pure ritual. They describe substances, procedures, and expected outcomes in language that parallels human medical texts, suggesting the composers understood them as genuine medical treatments that happen to have divine patients. One of the most revealing compositions is the text known as Enki and Ninmah, which exists in multiple copies including tablets in the British Museum, BM 12845, and the University of Pennsylvania Museum, CBS 2168. The text describes events that occurred before the creation of humanity, when the gods alone populated the cosmos. The narrative begins at a feast. The gods are drinking beer, becoming intoxicated. Enki and his mother Ninmah engage in what reads like drunken boasting. Ninmah claims she can create human forms of any kind, good or bad, as she chooses. Enki challenges this, saying he can determine the fate of whatever she creates and find uses even for flawed creations. Ninmah proceeds to create 6 beings with various impairments: one who can't hold back urine, one who can't see, one with trembling hands, one with failing feet. Each has what we would recognize as medical conditions or disabilities. For each, Enki finds a role. The one with trembling hands becomes a singer, the blind one becomes a musician, and so on. Then Enki creates a being so damaged, so fundamentally broken, that even Ninmah cannot find purpose or function for it. The specific nature of this final creation is debated in translation, but it's described as having severe cognitive and physical impairments. Ninmah is unable to care for it or assign it a role. She admits defeat. The text then describes Enki and Ninmah reconciling, the feast ending, and order being restored. On its surface, this appears to be an etiological myth, explaining why some humans are born with disabilities. Divine experimentation, creating templates for all forms of human existence. But there's a detail in the text that's usually passed over quickly. Before creating these test beings, the text describes Ninmah as being skilled in particular techniques. She's called Azugalatum in Akkadian, which translates roughly as chief physician or great healer. The text attributes to her specific medical knowledge, particularly knowledge related to birth and bodily creation. And throughout Mesopotamian literature, Ninmah, also called Ninhursag, Belet Eli, and other names, is consistently associated with healing, particularly divine healing. She appears in multiple texts as the deity who heals other gods when they're injured or suffering. One such text describes Enki himself requiring healing. The composition known as Enki and Ninhursag is set in Dilmun, a paradisiacal land where no sickness exists. But even in this ideal location, Enki creates problems. He impregnates various goddesses, then eats the plants that grow from their pregnancies. This violation of natural order causes 8 parts of his body to begin failing. His jaw, tooth, mouth, throat, limbs, side, and other organs are described as diseased or damaged. The gods are unable to heal him. One by one they try and fail. Finally, Ninhursag is convinced to intervene. She creates 8 healing deities, one for each of Enki's afflicted body parts. These deities heal the corresponding organs, and Enki is restored to health. The text describes this in procedural medical language. It's not abstract or metaphorical. It details specific body parts requiring specific treatments by specific healing entities. The narrative treats divine bodies as physical objects subject to damage and requiring intervention to restore function. This pattern appears across multiple texts. Gods can be wounded in battle. They can become ill. They can suffer from poison or venom. They can age and require rejuvenation. And critically, they can be healed through specific procedures involving specific substances. The Sumerian me are central to understanding this. The me are among the most difficult Mesopotamian concepts to translate clearly into English. They're usually rendered as divine powers, divine attributes, divine decrees, or divine norms. But none of these fully capture what the texts describe. The me encompass everything from abstract concepts like kingship and justice to concrete skills like metalworking and writing to what sound like technologies or capabilities. The me of descending to the underworld and ascending from it. The me of making decisions. The me of sexual intercourse. The me of conflict. Ancient lexical lists enumerate more than 100 specific me, and the lists aren't exhaustive. What's crucial about the me is that they're portable. They can be possessed, transferred, stolen, or lost. They're not inherent qualities that beings either have or lack based on their nature. They're things that can be acquired and removed. The most famous text involving me is Inanna and Enki, in which Inanna travels to Eridu where Enki lives. She gets him drunk, and while he's intoxicated, he gifts her the me one by one. The text lists them. He gave her the art of lovemaking. He gave her the art of kissing. He gave her the prostitute. He gave her the art of procreation, and on through dozens more. Once Inanna has the me, she loads them onto her boat of heaven and sails toward her city of Uruk. When Enki sobers up and realizes what he's done, he sends various servants to stop her and retrieve the me. Each attempt fails, and Inanna successfully brings the me to Uruk, where they're installed in her temple, permanently transferring those capabilities and authorities from Eridu to Uruk. Read as political allegory, this story encodes the historical shift of power and prestige from Eridu, the oldest Sumerian city, to Uruk, which rose to dominance in the late 4th millennium BA. The me represents civilizational capabilities being transferred between power centers. But, read literally, the text describes knowledge being physically transported. Enki possessed specific knowledge or technologies. Inanna obtained them. They were moved from one location to another, installed in a new temple, and became accessible there. If the me were portable knowledge, perhaps recorded information, perhaps technologies, perhaps procedural instructions, then their transferability makes sense. And if the me included capabilities like rejuvenation, healing, and life extension, then losing them would have serious consequences. There are texts describing gods losing specific me and becoming diminished as a result. When Inanna descends to the underworld and is stripped of her me at each gate, she becomes progressively weaker until she's vulnerable enough to be killed. When she's resurrected and the me are restored to her, she regains her full power and capabilities. This suggests the me weren't merely symbolic of power, they were the source of power. Removing them removed actual capabilities. If the Anunnaki used specific me related to rejuvenation and life extension, then maintaining access to those me would be critical. Losing them would mean losing the ability to restore youth, to heal injuries, to extend lifespan beyond its natural limits. Medical texts from later Mesopotamian periods describe specific substances used in healing rituals. Some are clearly symbolic: water from sacred springs, dust from particular temples, but others are pharmaceutical, plants with genuine medicinal properties, minerals with antiseptic qualities, procedures that suggest empirical medical knowledge. The Assyrian Medical Catalog, AMC, a systematic list of medical texts from the library of Ashurbanipal, categorizes therapeutic texts by condition and treatment. While most focus on human patients, some specifically address divine healing or describe substances associated with divine medicine. These are kept in separate categories from purely magical texts, suggesting the compilers distinguished between ritual symbolic healing and procedural medical healing. The plant Gilgamesh sought, the one that restores youth, is described with enough specificity that botanists have speculated about what actual plant it might have been. Some suggest a type of sea plant known for medicinal properties. Others propose it's legendary rather than botanical. But the Mesopotamian tradition treated it as real, a substance that existed in a specific location and had measurable, rejuvenating effects. If such substances existed and were known to the Anunnaki, if they used biological or technological means to extend their lifespans and restore their youth periodically, then their apparent immortality from a human perspective would be explained. A being who lives 28,800 years and can restore their youth multiple times during that lifespan would seem eternal to humans who live perhaps 70 years in age continuously throughout their lives. But that being would still be fundamentally mortal. Their existence would depend on continued access to rejuvenation technology. If that access was interrupted, if the knowledge was lost, if the substance became unavailable, if the me related to rejuvenation were stolen or destroyed, then they would age, decline, and eventually die. This creates a framework for understanding several puzzling aspects of Mesopotamian texts. The Anunnaki's concern with maintaining specific knowledge, with recording procedures in precise detail, with creating multiple copies of important texts. All of this makes sense if they understood that knowledge as necessary for their survival. The transmission of knowledge to human priests and scribes stops being generous divine gift and starts looking like contingency planning. If something happened to the Anunnaki, if their numbers declined or their access to necessary technologies was compromised, having humans who understood the procedures would provide backup. The massive temple complexes with their elaborate storage chambers, their extensive archives, their protected inner sanctums where only the highest priests could enter, these start to look less like symbolic divine residences and more like knowledge repositories, possibly containing the substances and technologies necessary for divine rejuvenation and healing. And the biblical story of the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, which God protects with cherubim and flaming sword after humanity is expelled, takes on new resonance. If there was knowledge or technology that granted extreme longevity, and if humanity was deliberately kept from accessing it, the biblical narrative might preserve distorted memory of actual restrictions placed on human access to Anunnaki rejuvenation capabilities. The text of Genesis describes the tree of life as providing eternal life to whoever eats its fruit. After Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, God says, "Behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand, and take also of the tree of life, and eat, and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden." Genesis 3:22 23. The phrasing is significant, lest he eat and live forever. The implication is that eating from the tree of life would grant immortality, and God deliberately prevents this. The tree exists. It has real effects. Access is restricted. This isn't standard Jewish or Christian theology, where only God is inherently eternal and all created beings are fundamentally mortal. This text suggests immortality could be obtained through specific means, a tree, a substance, a technology, and that access to those means was controlled. If we read biblical Genesis as preserving corrupted memory of Sumerian traditions, which we know influenced Israelite culture through centuries of exposure, then the Tree of Life might encode memory of Anunnaki rejuvenation technology that humans were deliberately prevented from accessing. The Sumerian texts don't speak of a single Tree of Life, but they frequently reference divine food and water that restore youth and health. The food of life and water of life that Enki creates to resurrect Inanna, the plant at the bottom of the sea that Gilgamesh seeks, various me related to life, youth, and rejuvenation that can be possessed and transferred. All of this suggests a tradition understood by the Mesopotamians to be real. The Anunnaki possessed means of extending life and restoring youth, means that humans didn't naturally have access to, means that required specific knowledge and specific substances to utilize. If that tradition preserves accurate memory, then the Anunnaki were beings who understood their mortality and took active measures to delay it. They weren't eternal. They were long-lived, knowledgeable, and possessed technologies that extended their existence far beyond human limits, but they existed within time, and time eventually runs out for all mortal creatures, unless the measures taken to preserve life continued functioning. Unless the knowledge was maintained. Unless the substances remained available, which raises the question, what happened if those measures failed? If the Anunnaki could be harmed despite their rejuvenation capabilities, if they could be killed even with all their divine powers, then their physical vulnerability becomes important. And the texts describe exactly that, gods whose bodies could bleed. Bodies that could bleed. The ancient Near Eastern conception of divinity wasn't the same as later Western theological frameworks. In Jewish, Christian, and Islamic tradition, God is typically understood as immaterial spirit, omnipotent and omnipresent, existing outside physical constraints. But the Mesopotamian gods, as described in their own texts, had bodies, physical bodies that occupied space, that required sustenance, that could be injured. This isn't disputed by scholars. The question is whether those bodies were understood as literal physical forms or as anthropomorphic projections, the Mesopotamians describing their gods in human terms because they lacked philosophical vocabulary for abstract divine essence. But the texts themselves suggest the Sumerians and Babylonians understood divine bodies as genuinely physical. When they describe gods eating and drinking, they use the same verbs applied to human consumption. When they describe divine bloodshed, they use anatomical terminology. When they describe healing divine wounds, they employ medical procedures parallel to those used on human patients. The most extensive descriptions of divine physical vulnerability come from battle narratives. Mesopotamian literature includes numerous accounts of divine combat, gods fighting monsters, fighting each other, fighting cosmic forces of chaos. These aren't abstract spiritual conflicts. They're physical confrontations, described with visceral detail. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, centers on Marduk's battle against Tiamat, the primordial sea dragon. Multiple versions of this text exist, with the most complete preserved on 7 tablets found at Ashurbanipal's Library British Museum tablets, including K549c. The epic describes cosmic origins through violent conflict between generations of gods. In the narrative, the younger gods make so much noise that it disturbs the ancient primordial deities Apsu and Tiamat. Apsu decides to destroy the younger gods to restore peace and quiet. But the Akkadian name for Enki, discovers the plot, uses magic to put Apsu to sleep, and kills him. Tiamat, enraged by her consort's death, creates an army of monsters to destroy the younger gods in revenge. The younger gods are terrified. They hold council to determine who can face Tiamat. Various gods are proposed and decline. They're afraid they'll be killed. Finally, Marduk, son of agrees to fight Tiamat, but only if the gods grant him supreme authority afterward. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat is described in concrete physical terms. Marduk arms himself with specific weapons: a bow, arrows, a mace, lightning, a net. He rides a chariot pulled by 4 supernatural horses. When he confronts Tiamat, he challenges her to single combat. She opens her mouth to swallow him. He shoots an arrow down her throat that pierces her heart, killing her. Then he splits her corpse in half, using one part to create the sky and the other to create the earth. The text describes Tiamat's body in anatomical detail. She has a heart that can be pierced. She has blood that flows from her wounds. Her corpse is solid matter that can be divided and shaped. When Marduk kills her, she dies. She doesn't merely transform or relocate to another realm. Her physical existence ends, and her body becomes raw material for cosmic construction. If Tiamat, a primordial deity described as existing from the beginning of time, can be killed through physical violence, an arrow through the heart, then divine bodies are vulnerable to physical harm. They can be penetrated, damaged, destroyed. Marduk himself is described in physical terms throughout the epic. He has a mouth, eyes, ears. He wears armor for protection, suggesting his body can be injured by weapons. He sweats during the battle. He grows tired. These aren't characteristics of immaterial spirit. They're characteristics of a physical being engaged in physical combat. Other combat narratives reinforce this pattern. The myth of Ninurta and Anzu describes the warrior god Ninurta fighting the bird monster Anzu, who has stolen the Tablet of Destinies from Enlil. The text exists in both Sumerian and Akkadian versions, with fragments found at multiple sites. In this narrative, Anzu steals the Tablet of Destinies, which controls cosmic authority. With the tablet, Anzu can nullify the god's powers. When Ninurta shoots arrows at Anzu, the monster uses the tablet's power to return the arrows to their wooden and feathered components before they strike. Ninurta can't harm Anzu as long as the tablet protects him. But Enki devises a strategy. He instructs Ninurta to create a dust storm that obscures Anzu's vision, then to aim for Anzu's wings. The attack succeeds. Anzu's wings are severed, he falls, and Ninurta recovers the Tablet of Destinies. The significant detail here is that divine power, embodied in the Tablet of Destinies, can be stolen, and even with that power, Anzu's physical body remains vulnerable. His wings can be cut. He can fall. Physical harm can defeat even a being wielding supreme cosmic authority. Ninurta himself is described as capable of being wounded. In other texts, He requires healing after battles. His divine mother, Ninhursag, treats his injuries using medical procedures. The texts don't say his honor was wounded or his reputation suffered. They describe physical wounds requiring physical treatment. The composition Lugale, also called Ninurta's Exploits, describes Ninurta's battle against the Asag, a demon who leads an army of stones. During the combat, Ninurta is described as being struck by stones, requiring him to take cover and at one point being knocked unconscious. His servant has to revive him. Eventually, Ninurta defeats Asag and reorganizes the cosmos, but not before experiencing genuine physical vulnerability. A god who can be knocked unconscious is a god whose consciousness depends on brain function. A god who requires revival after losing consciousness operates under the same neurological constraints as biological organisms. These details suggest divine bodies functioned biologically, not just symbolically. Inanna's physical vulnerability is demonstrated most dramatically in her descent to the underworld, but she faces danger in other texts as well. In Inanna and Ibi, she attacks the mountain Ibi after it refuses to show her proper respect. The battle is difficult. She has to use specific weapons and tactics. She can't simply will the mountain into submission. She has to physically assault it until it's destroyed. The text describes her as a warrior who arms herself, who fights, whose success depends on tactical competence, not just divine fiat. She's powerful, certainly vastly more powerful than humans. But her power operates through physical means. She uses weapons. She engages in combat. She can be resisted. One of the most revealing texts regarding divine physical vulnerability is a medical incantation preserved in multiple copies from various periods. The text describes a procedure for healing a god who has been bitten by a snake. It provides the incantation to be recited, the substances to be applied, and the expected outcome. The venom will be neutralized, the swelling will recede, the god will recover. Why would gods need protection from snake venom? Why would divine flesh react to venom the same way human flesh does, with swelling, with systemic poisoning that requires treatment? The standard interpretation is that this text relates to healing cult statues or to symbolic representations of divine illness. But the text itself doesn't indicate it's metaphorical. It's cataloged alongside medical texts for treating human snakebite, using similar terminology and procedural structure. The primary difference is the patient being divine rather than human. If we take the text at face value, it describes divine bodies as biochemically vulnerable to natural toxins. A snake that can poison a human can poison a god. The physiology isn't fundamentally different, just the scale of power and capability. This brings us to a crucial question. If the Anunnaki had physical bodies vulnerable to physical harm, what were those bodies made of? Were they biological in any sense we'd recognize? Or were they constructed from some other material that nonetheless responded to damage and required healing? The texts don't provide biochemistry, but they consistently describe divine bodies using the same anatomical vocabulary applied to human and animal bodies. Gods have blood, mu, Akkadian, demu, flesh, uzu, Akkadian, ru, bones, Marian, gigi, Akkadian, imtu. When they're injured, they bleed. When they consume food, they're nourished. When they engage in sexual activity, they can reproduce. The creation of humanity in atrahasis specifically requires mixing divine blood and flesh with clay, precisely because human biology needs to incorporate divine biological material to function at the required level. The text treats divine blood as a physical substance that can be extracted from a body, mixed with other materials, and used as a component in creating new biological organisms. This suggests divine bodies were biological. Perhaps not identical to human biology, the texts are clear that gods possess capabilities humans lack, but operating under biological constraints nonetheless. Bodies that could be nourished or starved, injured or healed, exhausted or revitalized. There's a practical reason why this matters for our investigation. If the Anunnaki had biological bodies vulnerable to physical harm, then they could be killed through physical violence, even if they possessed rejuvenation technology and extended lifespans. Dumuzi's death makes sense in this framework. The Gala demons physically seized him and physically destroyed his body. Whatever knowledge or technology the Anunnaki possessed for life extension couldn't help if the physical substrate of existence was sufficiently damaged. Gilgamesh's quest similarly makes sense. He was seeking the plant not because he was aging naturally and wanted to reverse it, but because he understood that his semi-divine body, while more durable than human bodies, would eventually age and fail unless he had access to rejuvenation technology. And if he could be killed through violence before accessing that technology, death would be permanent. The Anunnaki's vulnerability to physical harm would explain their need for weapons, for strategic planning in conflicts, for protecting themselves against threats. Gods who are truly omnipotent don't need weapons. They simply will their enemies out of existence. But gods who operate under physical constraints need physical tools to accomplish physical objectives. The archaeological record preserves artistic representations of divine figures that reinforce this physical interpretation. Cylinder seals, statues, and relief carvings depict gods as having definite physical forms, humanoid bodies, distinctive clothing, specific iconographic elements. These aren't abstract symbols. They're portraiture of beings understood to have appearance, presence, and physical existence. The most famous example is the Stele of Hammurabi, a 7-foot-tall carved stone monument from around 1750 BC, now in the Louvre Museum. The top of the stele depicts King Hammurabi standing before the seated god Shamash, who extends a rod and ring, symbols of divine authority, to the king. Shamash is portrayed as a physical being occupying space, sitting on a throne, holding objects. The carving isn't symbolic abstraction. It's representational art, depicting a specific interaction between a human king and a divine being. Similar representations appear throughout Mesopotamian art across thousands of years. Gods are depicted as physically present, as having bodies, as interacting with humans through physical proximity. Temple architecture includes rooms described as the god's bedroom, dining hall, throne room, spaces designed for beings who occupied physical space. The cult statues of gods weren't understood as mere symbols, but as the physical vessels in which the gods resided. Elaborate rituals marked the opening of the mouth ceremony that transformed a new statue into a living vessel for divine presence. Daily rituals provided the statues with food, drink, clothing, and other physical necessities. When cult statues were captured by enemies or destroyed, it was treated as the god being captured or injured, requiring rescue or healing. All of this suggests the Mesopotamians understood their gods as genuinely physical beings who could be harmed, whose bodies required maintenance, who existed in space and time rather than in some abstract spiritual dimension. If the Anunnaki were physical biological beings, extremely advanced, extremely long-lived, extremely capable, but still operating under physical constraints, then everything about how they're described in the texts makes more sense. They needed food because biological organisms need energy. They needed healing because biological tissue can be damaged. They needed rejuvenation because biological systems age. And they could die because biological existence is inherently finite without continuous maintenance. This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing category of texts in the Mesopotamian corpus, those that describe places where gods go when they die. The underworld texts, because if the Anunnaki could die, then what happened to them afterward? The underworld and its inmates. The Mesopotamian underworld, called Kur in Sumerian, Eritu in Akkadian, was understood as a real place with specific geography, administration, and population. It wasn't hell in the later Christian sense, a place of punishment for the wicked, nor was it quite like the Greek Hades, with its various regions for different types of dead. The Mesopotamian underworld was simply where the dead went. All of them, regardless of virtue or vice, regardless of status in life, every dead being descended to the Kur. But here's what's significant. The underworld wasn't only for dead humans. The texts consistently describe divine beings in the underworld as well. Some are rulers of that realm, some are judges, some are servants and administrators, and some are prisoners who cannot leave. Ereshkigal rules the underworld as its queen. She's described as Inanna's sister, a goddess with full divine status, who governs the realm of the dead. Her consort is Nergal, god of war and plague, who shares rule over the underworld with her. The text of Nergal and Ereshkigal describes how Nergal came to be trapped in the underworld and became its co-ruler. In that narrative, the gods hold a banquet in heaven, and Ereshkigal, who cannot leave the underworld, sends her minister Namtar to receive her portion of the feast. But Nergal refuses to show proper respect to Namtar. This insults Ereshkigal, who demands Nergal be sent to the underworld to answer for the offense. Nergal descends to the underworld. Ereshkigal attempts to trap him there, but Nergal is powerful enough to threaten her directly. He seizes her and prepares to kill her, but she offers him a compromise. If he becomes her consort and shares rule of the underworld, she'll let him return to the surface periodically. Nergal agrees, and the arrangement is established. The text treats this as explaining how Nergal became bound to the underworld. He's trapped there, unable to permanently leave, though he can make temporary visits to the upper world. This is a god, a powerful warrior god, who becomes imprisoned in a realm he cannot escape. The 7 Anunnaki judges of the underworld are described as ancient gods who dwell there permanently, rendering judgments on all who enter. Their gaze is described as deadly. When they look at Inanna during her unauthorized descent, their judgment kills her. These are gods whose primary function is administration of death, who exist in the realm of death, who appear to be bound to that realm. Dumuzi, after his death at the hands of the Gala demons, descends to the underworld and becomes trapped there. The compromise that allows him periodic release doesn't restore him to full life. He remains fundamentally a resident of the realm of the dead, permitted temporary reprieve, but always required to return. The text describes the underworld as dark, dusty, where the dead eat clay and drink muddy water. They're clothed in feathers like birds. They exist in diminished form, conscious but limited, unable to return to the upper world without divine intervention. It's described as a house with no exit, a road from which there is no return. But some beings do return. Inanna returned through Enki's intervention and the application of food and water of life. Her servant Ninshubur attempted to rescue her by appealing to the great gods. The fact that escape is possible but extremely difficult suggests the underworld isn't metaphorical oblivion. It's a physical location from which physical rescue can theoretically occur. The most detailed description of the underworld's geography comes from various descent texts. Inanna's descent describes 7 gates, each requiring removal of one piece of her divine regalia. By the time she reaches the throne room, she's been completely stripped of the me, the divine powers she possessed. Only then can she be killed. This suggests the underworld has properties that neutralize divine power. The me don't function there, or function differently. Beings who possess enormous capabilities in the upper world become powerless in the underworld. Their physical bodies remain. Inanna's corpse is described in detail, but the attributes that made them godlike are stripped away. What kind of place could do this? If the me were technologies or knowledge-based capabilities, then the underworld might be a location where those technologies don't work, where the knowledge becomes inaccessible. But the texts describe it as having specific physical characteristics, darkness, dust, specific architectural features. It's underground, beneath the surface world, but still within physical reality. Some scholars have proposed that the Mesopotamian underworld concept might preserve memory of actual underground facilities, massive subterranean complexes where certain Anunnaki resided, or where they stored important materials. The ancient world did construct underground chambers, tombs, storage facilities, refuges. If some Anunnaki dwelt in underground locations, humans visiting those places would experience them as dark, enclosed, cut off from the surface world, characteristics attributed to the underworld in the texts. This is speculative, but it would explain why the texts treat the underworld as geographically real, as having physical entry points, as being a place you could theoretically travel to and from. It would explain why specific rituals and specific substances could enable escape. If the underworld was a physical location with specific properties, then knowledge of those properties would allow for potential rescue operations. What's certain is that the Mesopotamians understood some divine beings to be permanently or semi-permanently trapped in the underworld. They weren't free to leave. They existed in that realm under constraints they couldn't simply overcome through divine fiat. And critically, humans understood it was possible to end up there permanently after death. The Epic of Gilgamesh includes a scene in which Enkidu has a prophetic dream of the underworld before his death. He describes being seized by a terrifying figure with lion paws and eagle talons who drags him down to the House of Darkness. In the underworld, he sees former kings and priests existing in diminished form, serving as attendants to the underworld deities. When Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is distraught, partly because he knows Enkidu is trapped in the underworld, existing in that terrible diminished state. In some versions of Gilgamesh traditions, the hero himself eventually descends to the underworld after death, but even his semi-divine nature doesn't exempt him. He takes up a position as administrator or judge in the underworld, a better fate than ordinary dead, certainly, but still imprisoned in the realm of death, unable to return to the living world. If the underworld was real and inescapable, if even gods could become trapped there, then death was genuinely terrible even for beings with divine capabilities. It wasn't transition to another mode of existence or spiritual transformation. It was imprisonment in a dark, limited realm where even consciousness of one's reduced state provided no means of escape. This explains the desperate fear of death expressed throughout Mesopotamian literature. It wasn't just humans who feared death, gods feared it too. Because death meant the cur, and the cur was a trap from which almost no one returned. The lamentation texts provide the most poignant expressions of this fear, and they describe something even more disturbing: gods abandoning their cities, unable or unwilling to protect them from destruction. When the gods abandoned their cities. Between 2000 and 1900 BC, the third dynasty of Ur collapsed. The empire that had controlled Mesopotamia for more than a century fell to invading forces, primarily the Elamites from the east. The capital city of Ur was sacked and burned. Other major Sumerian cities, Nippur, Eridu, Uruk, Lagash, suffered similar fates. It was a catastrophe on the scale of civilization itself collapsing, and the Sumerians wrote about it extensively. They produced a genre of texts called city laments, lengthy poetic compositions mourning the destruction of specific cities. The most famous is the lamentation over the destruction of Ur, which exists in multiple copies including tablets CBS 3878, 6889, 6905, 7975, 8079, and others from the University of Pennsylvania Museum's Nippur collection. These texts are heart-wrenching. They describe in vivid detail the burning of temples, the slaughter of populations, the destruction of everything that made civilization possible. But what's most significant for our investigation is how they describe the gods' response to this catastrophe. The gods abandoned their cities. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur describes the goddess Ningal, patron deity of Ur and consort of the moon god Nana, pleading in divine counsel for her city to be spared. She makes impassioned arguments before An and Enlil, but the decision has been made. Ur will be destroyed. Ningal and Nana are told to leave the city before the destruction arrives. The text describes their departure. Nana, who loves his city, went outside his city. Ningal, who loves her city, went outside her city. They abandon Ur not by choice, but by necessity. They cannot prevent what's coming. They cannot protect their own city, their own temple, their own people. The lamentation is explicit about what happens next. The storm of Enlil swept over the city, the storm ordered by Enlil in hate. The storm which wears away the land covered Ur like a cloth, veiled it like a linen sheet. The destruction is described as divinely ordained but executed through physical means, foreign armies, fire, violence. And Ningal, from outside the city, watches it burn. She laments, "The city that I do not dwell in, may it be left in ruins. Ur, which I do not rule over, may it be a desolate wasteland. My possessions, may they be carried off." A goddess, patron of her city, powerful enough to have temples and cult, worshipped by thousands, helpless to prevent her city's destruction. She can flee, she can survive, but she cannot fight. She cannot protect what was hers. This pattern repeats across multiple city laments. The lamentation for Sumer and Ur describes multiple gods abandoning their cities. Enlil called the storm. The people mourn. Exhilarating winds he took from the land. The people mourn. Good winds he took away from Sumer. The people mourn. The lamentation for Nippur describes the goddess Ninlil fleeing as her city is destroyed. The lamentation for Eridu describes the god Enki unable to prevent his city's devastation. City after city, the same story, divine patrons departing, unable to protect what they'd built. Why? If the gods were truly omnipotent, why couldn't they protect their cities? If they had the power to create civilization, why couldn't they defend it? The standard mythological interpretation is that the gods chose to allow the destruction as punishment for human failings. The texts themselves sometimes frame it this way. Enlil decreed that would fall because of political instability or moral decay. The destruction was divine will, not divine limitation. But the emotional tone of the laments suggests something else. The patron deities aren't described as righteously allowing deserved punishment. They're described as devastated, helpless, watching in anguish as everything they built is destroyed. Ningal's lament for reads like genuine grief for catastrophic loss she couldn't prevent. If we take the texts at face value, the gods fled because they had to, because they lacked the power to stop the armies that were coming, because staying would mean being trapped in burning cities, possibly being killed themselves. The destruction was real. Archaeological excavations at reveal extensive burning layers from precisely this period. The city was systematically sacked. The same evidence appears at other Sumerian sites. The catastrophe described in the laments actually happened, and if the gods were physically present in those cities, dwelling in their temple complexes as the texts consistently describe, then the invasion posed genuine danger to them. Remaining in a city under siege meant potentially being captured, injured, or killed. The rational response was to evacuate before the destruction arrived. This reading transforms the laments from theological meditation on divine justice into historical documentation of events where physically vulnerable Anunnaki made the practical decision to abandon cities they couldn't defend, rather than risk their own destruction. It also explains why the gods needed human armies. Throughout Mesopotamian history, military action was described as being undertaken on behalf of the gods, with divine approval and support. Kings claimed divine mandate for their conquests, but the actual fighting was done by human soldiers. The gods didn't descend from heaven to personally smite their enemies. They relied on human military forces to accomplish physical objectives. If the gods were physically vulnerable beings who could be injured or killed, then using human armies makes perfect sense. Why risk divine casualties when humans could fight and die in wars that ultimately served divine interests? The god provided authority and perhaps strategic guidance, but humans provided the actual military force. The fall of the third dynasty of marked the end of Sumerian political dominance. Afterward, power shifted to Akkadian and Amorite dynasties. The Sumerian language gradually declined from spoken vernacular to scholarly language maintained by scribes. Sumerian civilization didn't end abruptly, but it entered a long period of decline from which it never fully recovered. And significantly, texts from after this period describe the world differently. The gods seem more distant, less directly involved in human affairs. Temples continue functioning, but the sense of immediate divine presence that permeates earlier texts becomes muted. It's as though something fundamental changed during that catastrophic period. If the Anunnaki suffered losses during the invasions, if some were killed, if others withdrew to safer locations, if their numbers were reduced, that would explain the shift. A smaller population of Anunnaki, possibly traumatized by the violence that destroyed their cities, might have chosen to limit their direct involvement with humans, to govern from greater distance, to rely more heavily on human intermediaries. The texts preserve one more crucial detail: measurements of divine lifespans. Because if the Anunnaki could die through violence, and if some did die during the catastrophes of the late 3rd millennium BC, then we should expect to find evidence that their presence diminished over time. And remarkably, we do find exactly that evidence, encoded in perhaps the strangest document in all of Mesopotamian literature, the Sumerian king list. Lifespans measured in Sar. Return with me to the Sumerian king list, which we touched on earlier but must now examine in detail, because this text, more than any other, contains mathematical evidence that the Anunnaki existed within time rather than beyond it. The most complete version of the king list is WB 444, the Weld-Blundell prism, a four-sided clay prism inscribed around 2000 BCE, now housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. Additional fragments and variant versions exist in multiple collections, providing cross-referencing for corrupted passages. The text presents itself as a chronological record of kingship from the mythological past through historical rulers contemporary with its composition. The opening line is justly famous: after kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. It then proceeds to list the first rulers. In Eridu, Ululim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Aljar ruled for 36,000 years. Two kings, they ruled for 64,800 years. The text continues through 8 antediluvian kings ruling 5 cities: Eridu, Bad-Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, before the flood came. The total duration of antediluvian kingship, 241,200 years. Then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. Post-flood rulers are still given enormous lifespans, but drastically reduced from antediluvian numbers. The first king of the first dynasty of Kish rules 1,200 years. Subsequent kings rule 960 years, 900 years, 625 years. As the list progresses chronologically, reign lengths continue to decrease: 420 years, 305 years, 140 years. Eventually, the numbers reach plausibly human lifespans for rulers whose reigns can be verified through contemporary documents. Gilgamesh appears in the first dynasty of Uruk, with a reign of 126 years, still superhuman, but approaching possible. Historical kings from the later 3rd millennium are given reign lengths of 1040 years, entirely consistent with human lifespan and with independent evidence. The pattern is clear: an exponential decrease in reign lengths from antediluvian times through the 3rd millennium, eventually reaching normal human ranges. Mainstream scholarship has proposed various explanations. Perhaps the numbers are symbolic, carrying mathematical or cosmological significance rather than literal chronology. Perhaps early sections of the list compress dynasties or multiple rulers into single names. Perhaps the numbers employ base 60 calculation systems differently than we understand. Perhaps the entire antediluvian section is pure mythology with no connection to history. All of these explanations are possible. But there's another interpretation that takes the numbers seriously as measurements. The antediluvian numbers are enormous, but they're specific, not infinity, not time beyond counting. Specific durations: 28,800 years, 36,000 years, 43,200 years. These numbers follow patterns. They're multiples of 3,600, which is 1 Sar in Sumerian numerical calculation. Ululim ruled 8 Sar, Alalyar ruled 10 sar, Enmen-Luana ruled 12 sar. The antediluvian rulers' reigns are measured in sar units, just as later rulers' reigns are measured in year units. If these are measurements of actual time, if the antediluvian rulers were Anunnaki, who genuinely lived for tens of thousands of years, then several things become clear. First, even 28,800 years is not infinity. It's an extraordinarily long time from a human perspective. A being who ruled for 28,800 years would witness the entire span of human civilization as we know it, from the first agricultural villages through the rise and fall of multiple empires. Such a being would seem eternal to humans who lived 70 years. But 28,800 years is still measured time. It has a beginning and an end point. It implies mortality, just on a scale humans can barely conceptualize. Second, the decrease in lifespans after the flood suggests the flood had real biological consequences. Something changed. The antediluvian rulers' lifespans averaged 30,150 years. Post-flood lifespans dropped to hundreds or low thousands of years. Eventually, they declined further into normal human ranges. If the flood destroyed infrastructure, technology, or access to rejuvenation capabilities, that would explain declining lifespans. The earlier Anunnaki had full access to whatever technologies extended life. After the flood's destruction, access became limited or lost, resulting in reduced lifespans even for semi-divine rulers. Third, the gradual transition from superhuman to human lifespans suggests genetic dilution. If the antediluvian rulers were full Anunnaki, and if they interbred with humans over generations, then their descendants would be progressively less genetically Anunnaki and more genetically human. Gilgamesh, at 126 years, represents a hybrid stage, partly divine but sufficiently human that his lifespan approaches human ranges. Later rulers are fully human, having only distant Anunnaki ancestry that no longer meaningfully affects their biology. This pattern of declining lifespans appears elsewhere in ancient Near Eastern texts. The biblical Genesis describes patriarchs before the flood living hundreds of years. Methuselah 969 years, Noah 950 years. After the flood, lifespans gradually decline. Abraham 175 years, Moses 120 years, eventually settling into the normal human range of 70 years described in Psalms. The biblical tradition isn't independent of Mesopotamian tradition. The Israelites lived in Mesopotamia, were exiled there, and absorbed Mesopotamian narratives. But the parallel pattern is noteworthy. Both traditions preserve memory of ancient times when humans lived much longer than they do now, with lifespans declining over time. If we take the Sumerian numbers seriously as actual measurements, we can calculate dates. Working backward from historical kings whose reigns can be dated, and accounting for the chronology given in the king list, the flood would have occurred around 2900 BC. This doesn't match geological evidence for a global flood, but it does roughly correspond to archaeological evidence for extensive flooding in Mesopotamia that destroyed multiple early cities. The Shuruppak flood layer, discovered at the site of ancient Shuruppak Dan Tel Farah, shows evidence of catastrophic flooding around 2900-2800 BCE. The excavator noted a thick deposit of clean clay separating pre-flood and post-flood occupation layers. Similar flood deposits appear at and other sites, though dating is debated. If there was a catastrophic regional flood in Mesopotamia around 2900 BC that destroyed major cities and killed large populations, that would explain both the archaeological evidence, and the textual traditions. For people living in Mesopotamia, regional flood that destroyed all known cities would be indistinguishable from global flood. Their world was flooded. Everyone they knew of died, except survivors in boats. And if that flood destroyed infrastructure, archives, and technologies that the Anunnaki depended on for extended lifespans, post-flood populations, both Anunnaki and humans, would experience reduced longevity. The king list's numbers, if taken seriously, suggest the Anunnaki experienced lifespans measured in tens of thousands of years before the flood and thousands of years after the flood. Their half-human descendants experienced lifespans measured in hundreds of years, gradually declining to normal human ranges as the genetic contribution became more diluted. All of this is measured time. Long time, extraordinarily long time, but measured nonetheless. None of the numbers approach infinity. Every lifespan has a duration, which means every life has an end. The Anunnaki in this reading were mortal beings with vastly extended lifespans, probably maintained through technologies or biological differences that humans didn't fully understand. When those technologies were disrupted or lost, lifespans declined. When the Anunnaki interbred with humans, their descendants inherited progressively less of whatever genetic or biological factors enabled extreme longevity. By the second millennium BC, when most of our texts were being written, the full Anunnaki may have been largely gone, either died, withdrawn, or so reduced in numbers that they no longer actively governed. Their half-human descendants ruled as kings, claiming divine ancestry but living human lifespans. Civilization continued based on systems the Anunnaki had established, but humans now ran those systems, guided by texts and traditions the Anunnaki had left behind. This brings us to the interpretive question we've been building toward throughout this investigation. We've examined the evidence. We've looked at what the texts actually say. Now we must ask, how do we read this evidence? What explanations make sense of it? The three interpretations. We've examined dozens of texts across 2,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization. We've looked at accounts of gods toiling and rebelling. We've analyzed descriptions of divine death, wounding, aging, and rejuvenation. We've traced mathematical patterns and measured lifespans. We've read lamentations of gods fleeing cities they couldn't protect. We've explored the underworld where divine beings become trapped. All of this evidence exists. The tablets are real. The words are accurately translated. The patterns are observable across multiple independent sources. We're not dealing with fringe texts or disputed interpretations. This is mainstream Sumerian and Akkadian literature, carefully preserved by the Mesopotamians themselves as important knowledge. The question is, what does it mean? There are three major interpretive frameworks, and intellectual honesty requires we examine each fairly. The mythological interpretation is the mainstream scholarly consensus. In this reading, the Sumerian and Akkadian texts are sophisticated theological and literary compositions that personify natural forces, encode social and political relationships, and explore profound questions about human existence through narrative frameworks. The gods represent aspects of reality given anthropomorphic form, so humans can relate to them. Enlil is storm and atmospheric power. Inanna is the chaotic force of sexuality and warfare. Enki is human wisdom and technical knowledge. The conflicts between gods encode conflicts between natural forces, between cities, between political factions. Divine mortality in this framework is symbolic. Dumuzi's death and return represent agricultural cycles. The gods abandoning their cities represents the political reality that local cults couldn't protect against military invasion. The vast lifespans in the king list are mythological exaggeration, perhaps encoding dynastic lengths rather than individual reigns, perhaps symbolizing the great antiquity of Mesopotamian civilization. The Mesopotamians themselves, in this interpretation, didn't believe their gods were literal physical beings. They understood they were using poetic language to describe forces and relationships, just as we might speak of fortune being fickle or justice being blind, without believing fortune and justice are literal persons. This interpretation has significant strengths. It fits established patterns of how mythology functions across cultures. It doesn't require us to accept extraordinary claims about ancient advanced beings. It accounts for the evidence using well-understood psychological and cultural mechanisms. It's conservative, parsimonious, and academically responsible. And it may be correct, but it has difficulties accounting for certain details. The Mesopotamians demonstrated sophisticated abstract thinking in mathematics and astronomy. They weren't primitive people who only thought in concrete terms. If they intended their god texts as allegory, why didn't they signal that anywhere? Why did they treat the same texts that describe gods as having the same documentary authority as administrative records and astronomical observations? And why the obsessive detail? If you're creating allegory about agricultural cycles, why specify that Dumuzi's cup was shattered and his churn overturned? Why provide architectural specifications for boats in the flood narrative? Why record specific reign lengths for antediluvian kings in consistent units across multiple text versions? Allegory is usually less specific, not more. It generalizes to make symbolic points clearer. The Sumerian texts do the opposite. They provide excess detail that would be unnecessary for symbolic purposes but would be expected in documentary accounts. The encoded wisdom interpretation is less common in mainstream scholarship but has proponents in alternative research communities. In this reading, the Mesopotamian texts encode sophisticated spiritual, philosophical, or scientific knowledge in narrative form. The gods represent principles or technologies, and the narratives describe processes. Creation accounts encode cosmology or physics. Medical texts describing divine healing preserve advanced pharmaceutical knowledge. Mathematical patterns in lifespans encode astronomical cycles or calendrical calculations. In this framework, the Anunnaki weren't physical beings, but were representations of principles or perhaps metaphors for human-god interaction in mystical experience. The texts were written to preserve advanced knowledge in a form that would survive civilization collapse, with the narrative framework protecting the core information even if literal meaning was lost. This interpretation takes the Mesopotamians seriously as sophisticated thinkers, while accounting for the apparent impossibilities in the texts. It explains the precision and detail as serving mnemonic and encoding functions. It suggests there's real knowledge in these texts, just not the kind of knowledge a literal reading would suggest. The difficulties with this interpretation mirror those of the mythological reading. If the Mesopotamians were encoding information, why didn't they provide any indication of the decoding scheme? Ancient technical texts in other domains, mathematical tablets, medical texts, astronomical observations, are straightforward and practical. Why would the most important knowledge be encoded while routine information was recorded plainly? And while some symbolic interpretations are compelling, 7 gates perhaps representing stages of initiation, underworld journey perhaps representing psychological transformation, many details resist symbolic reading. What does it encode that Ulurum ruled exactly 28,800 years rather than some other number? Why specify that the flood lasted 7 days and 7 nights rather than using a more symbolically significant number like 40? The documentary interpretation is the most radical and the least accepted in mainstream scholarship, but it's the one we must consider given the evidence we've examined. In this reading, the Sumerian texts preserve genuine historical memory of events involving powerful, knowledgeable, long-lived beings, the Mesopotamians, called Anunnaki. These beings were not gods in the theological sense, but were dramatically more advanced than humans, possessing technologies humans didn't understand, living for periods of time humans couldn't match, and establishing the systems that became Mesopotamian civilization. They were mortal. They could be injured, could die, required sustenance and healing. They possessed rejuvenation capabilities that extended their lifespans into tens of thousands of years. But those technologies required maintenance and could be lost or destroyed. They established cities, governed human populations, and transmitted knowledge to human administrators and scribes. The flood was a real catastrophe that destroyed their infrastructure and killed many of them. After the flood, their numbers declined, their lifespans shortened as their access to rejuvenation technology diminished, and they gradually withdrew from direct governance as their population decreased through death and as their descendants became progressively more genetically human through interbreeding. By the 2nd millennium BC, when the bulk of our texts were written, the full Anunnaki were largely gone. Human scribes were preserving traditions about them, copying ancient texts, maintaining systems the Anunnaki had established, but which humans now operated. The texts are documentation, not always perfectly understood by the scribes who copied them, not always complete, sometimes corrupted, or misunderstood, but fundamentally preserving memory of actual beings and actual events. This interpretation takes the Mesopotamians at their word. It reads texts as they appear to be written, as accounts of events. It explains the specificity and consistency across independent sources. It accounts for why the texts treat divine interactions as administrative and procedural rather than mystical or symbolic. And it requires accepting something extraordinary, that beings existed in the ancient past who were dramatically more advanced than the humans who recorded accounts of them, but who were nonetheless mortal and have since vanished from direct human contact. The difficulties with this interpretation are obvious. It requires evidence we don't have. If the Anunnaki were real, where are their remains? Where are their technologies? Where is the physical evidence that would conclusively prove advanced beings existed in ancient Mesopotamia? The absence of such evidence isn't necessarily decisive. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, especially for events 5,000 years ago. But extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and we don't have it. We have texts. We have interpretations of texts. We have patterns in those texts that could be explained multiple ways. So which interpretation is correct? Intellectual honesty requires acknowledging we don't know with certainty. Each framework has strengths and weaknesses. Each can account for much of the evidence while struggling with specific details. What we can say is this: the Sumerian texts consistently describe the Anunnaki as physical, powerful, knowledgeable, long-lived, and mortal. Whether that description preserves actual history, encodes sophisticated allegory, or serves theological and literary purposes, the description itself is clear and consistent. The Mesopotamians who wrote these texts dedicated enormous effort to preserving them. They treated them as important knowledge worth copying for thousands of years. They maintained archives, created libraries, trained scribes in the specific skills needed to read and interpret these compositions. Whatever these texts are, they mattered, and perhaps that's enough reason to take them seriously, to read them carefully, to resist the temptation to dismiss them as primitive mythology or pre-scientific confusion. Because if there's even a possibility that the documentary interpretation has merit, if there's a chance the Sumerians preserved accurate memory of beings who were once present but are no longer among us, then the implications reshape everything we understand about human history. What it would mean. Let's consider, as a thought experiment, what follows if the documentary interpretation has any merit. What would it mean if the Sumerians accurately recorded observations of powerful, knowledgeable, mortal beings who established civilization and then gradually disappeared? First, it would mean civilization didn't develop purely through human ingenuity. The sudden appearance of urban centers, writing, mathematics, sophisticated astronomy, advanced irrigation engineering, metallurgy, and organized administration in southern Mesopotamia around 3500 BC wasn't the result of slow cultural evolution. It was knowledge transferred from beings who already possessed it to humans who were taught how to implement. This doesn't diminish human achievement. Maintaining and developing systems is itself an enormous accomplishment, but it locates the origin of those systems elsewhere, with a source population that had already solved problems humans were just encountering. It would explain why Sumerian civilization appears so suddenly in the archaeological record. There's no long gradual development of writing. Cuneiform appears fully formed as a complex system. There's no series of progressively more sophisticated irrigation attempts. The canal networks appear as mature engineering from their earliest evidence. The standard explanation is that earlier developmental stages remain undiscovered, buried deeper, or in locations not yet excavated. But if knowledge was transmitted from already knowledgeable sources, no developmental stages would exist. The systems would appear mature because they were implemented by populations who already understood how they worked. Second, it would mean the relationship between humans and the Anunnaki wasn't worship of timeless deities, but interaction with powerful but mortal beings. Humans served them not out of mystical devotion, but because the Anunnaki governed civilization, and humans depended on systems those governors maintained. When the Anunnaki withdrew or declined in numbers, humans inherited governance, but also inherited vulnerability. The city-states of Mesopotamia fought constantly through the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC, each claiming divine mandate, but none able to establish lasting hegemony. If the Anunnaki had previously enforced stability through their authority, their absence would explain the political fragmentation, that characterized later Mesopotamian history. Third, it would mean the knowledge preserved in cuneiform texts is a mixture of human and non-human origin. Some texts record human observations and human administrative activities, but some preserve knowledge transmitted from the Anunnaki, technical knowledge, mathematical knowledge, astronomical knowledge, medical knowledge, that humans copied and maintained even when they didn't fully understand it. This would explain certain anomalies in Mesopotamian science. They understood sophisticated mathematics, including Pythagorean principles, more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras. They tracked planetary movements with precision that shouldn't have been possible with naked eye observation. They possessed medical knowledge about human anatomy that would seem to require dissection, yet we have no evidence they practiced systematic dissection. If they inherited some knowledge from sources who already possessed it, and if scribes faithfully copied that knowledge even when they didn't fully comprehend why it was true, that would explain both the sophistication and the occasional gaps in understanding evident in the texts. Fourth, it would mean the disappearance of the Anunnaki created a knowledge crisis that drove the Mesopotamian obsession with textual preservation. If vital knowledge existed only in the memories of beings who were dying, humans would be desperate to record everything those beings knew before they were gone. The vast libraries, the constant copying of texts, the training of professional scribes whose primary function was preservation rather than creation, all of this suggests a civilization terrified of losing knowledge, treating information as fragile and desperately valuable. That makes sense if they were in the position of students whose teachers were dying, trying frantically to record all the instruction before the teachers were gone forever. Fifth, it would mean other ancient traditions about gods or powerful ancient beings might preserve similar memories. The biblical Nephilim, described as offspring of sons of God and human women, who were mighty men of old. The Egyptian divine kingship traditions, the Vedic accounts of devas and their interactions with humans, Greek stories of titans and heroes with divine parentage. Common patterns across geographically separated traditions could indicate common source, memory of a category of beings who existed in the ancient world, interacted with humans, had offspring with humans, and eventually disappeared from active involvement in human affairs. This isn't proof. Cultural diffusion, universal human psychological patterns, and independent invention all produce common motifs across traditions. But if the Mesopotamian texts preserve actual memory, it becomes at least possible that other traditions do as well. Sixth, it would mean the question, what happened to them, becomes historical rather than theological. If the Anunnaki were mortal, if they could die, if their numbers declined over millennia, where did they go? The text suggests several possibilities. Some died in catastrophes like the flood. Some died in conflicts. Some may have withdrawn to locations not accessible to humans. Some may have interbred so thoroughly with humans that their descendants became genetically indistinguishable from human populations, preserving only fragments of their ancestors' extended lifespans and capabilities. The Sumerian king list's pattern of declining lifespans suggests genetic dilution was a major factor. If Anunnaki genetic material conferred extreme longevity, but interbreeding with humans produced offspring with intermediate lifespans, then after enough generations the genetic contribution would be diluted to the point where it no longer meaningfully affected biology. The Anunnaki would effectively disappear into human population, leaving only the systems and knowledge they'd established as evidence they'd existed. By the time we reach historical periods with contemporary written records, the late 3rd millennium and beyond, rulers claim divine ancestry, but live ordinary human lifespans. They govern according to traditions established by the Anunnaki, but are fully human themselves. The last semi-divine kings are figures like Gilgamesh, partly divine, living longer than normal humans, but not approaching the vast lifespans recorded for earlier rulers. After Gilgamesh, humanity is alone, still living in cities the Anunnaki established, still using writing systems they taught, still performing rituals they instituted, but alone. Seventh, and perhaps most unsettling, it would mean that humanity's entire self-understanding is built on amnesia. We think we invented civilization through our own efforts. We think our cities, our writing, our sciences, our human achievements developed over thousands of years of cultural evolution. But if the Sumerians accurately recorded our actual history, then civilization was given to us. We were created as a labor force. We were taught systems we didn't invent. We inherited technologies we didn't develop. And when the beings who established all of it declined and disappeared, we convinced ourselves we'd done it alone, reinterpreting our own history as human achievement rather than inheritance. The question mark that hangs over all of this is evidence. If the Anunnaki were real, if they were physical biological beings who lived in Mesopotamia for thousands of years and had offspring with humans, we should be able to find physical proof. Remains, technologies, artifacts that are inconsistent with Bronze Age human capabilities. Some researchers claim such evidence exists: megalithic architecture that seems beyond Bronze Age engineering capabilities, artifacts with anachronistic complexity, skeletal remains of unusual size or structure. But mainstream archaeology has explanations for all of these that don't require advanced ancient beings. Human ingenuity is sufficient to account for impressive architecture. Supposed out-of-place artifacts typically result from misunderstanding or contamination, and unusual skeletal remains usually represent pathology rather than separate populations. The absence of definitive physical evidence is the strongest argument against the documentary interpretation. If it were true, we should have proof. The fact that we don't have proof, despite more than a century of intensive archaeology in Mesopotamia, suggests the texts aren't documenting literal history. But absence of evidence isn't quite the same as evidence of absence, especially given how much of the ancient world has been destroyed, how many buildings have been burned, how many texts have been lost, how much has been buried under 5,000 years of sediment and occupation. And if the Anunnaki withdrew intentionally, if they had reasons for leaving minimal trace of their presence, the lack of obvious evidence becomes less surprising. Advanced beings departing would presumably remove their advanced technologies. Bodies buried 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia's climate wouldn't preserve well, especially if they were deliberately buried in ways meant to prevent discovery. The evidence we have is texts, thousands of texts, carefully preserved, consistently describing beings who sound mortal but dramatically more capable than humans. The interpretation of those texts remains open to debate. The question in the clay. Return one last time to CBS 10673. The tablet that opened this investigation. It rests in its archival foam in the climate-controlled vault, the same pale terracotta surface, the same wedge marks pressed by a reed stylus 4 millennia ago. The scribe who created it probably didn't know they were encoding a mystery that would perplex people 4,000 years later. They were doing their job, copying an important text, preserving knowledge they'd been trained to preserve. The composition itself was already ancient when they inscribed it, traditions passed down from earlier times, perhaps already not fully understood. What did they believe they were recording? History? Theology? Both? Neither? We can't ask them. We can only read what they wrote and decide for ourselves how to interpret it. The question of whether the Anunnaki were mortal isn't answerable with certainty. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. We have texts. We have interpretations. We have patterns that could mean multiple things. Definitive proof exists neither for the mythological reading nor the documentary reading. Both remain intellectually viable. But the question itself matters, because how we read these texts affects how we understand human history, human capability, and human origins. If civilization developed purely through human ingenuity, gradually evolving from simpler to more complex forms as we learned and experimented and built on previous generations' knowledge, then humanity is the sole author of its own advancement. Everything we have, we created. Every problem we face, we must solve alone. That's both empowering and daunting. We're capable of remarkable achievement, but we're also entirely responsible for our trajectory. If civilization was given to us, if we inherited systems we didn't develop, if we're maintaining knowledge that originated elsewhere, then our relationship to our own culture is different. We're stewards, rather than creators, preserving and developing what was transmitted to us. That requires humility but also provides hope. If we're struggling with problems, perhaps solutions exist in knowledge we've inherited but haven't fully understood yet. The Sumerian scribes seem to operate under the second assumption. They treated texts as precious, preserving them through catastrophes and political upheavals, maintaining scribal schools that trained new generations in reading and interpretation. They acted as though the knowledge they protected was irreplaceable, as though losing it would be catastrophic, and they may have been right. The sophistication of Mesopotamian mathematics, astronomy, and medicine declined after the Mesopotamian cultural tradition ended. Medieval scholarship preserved only fragments, often misunderstood. It took millennia to rediscover principles the Babylonians had understood 2,000 years earlier. If there was even more knowledge in those texts than we currently recognize, if there are layers of meaning or information we haven't fully decoded, then the Mesopotamian scribes' obsessive preservation has given us a gift we're only beginning to unwrap. What we know with certainty is this: the Sumerians described the Anunnaki as powerful, knowledgeable, consequential, and mortal. Whether that description preserves historical memory, encodes sophisticated allegory, or serves cultural and theological functions, it represents how the world's first literate civilization understood its own origins. They saw themselves as having been taught, not as having invented. They saw their gods as existing within time, not beyond it. They saw mortality as universal, affecting even the most powerful beings, with only the time scale varying. And they wrote it all down, pressed it into clay, fired it or dried it, stored it in archives, copied it when it deteriorated, and passed it forward across generations until it reached us. 4,000 years after a scribe in Nippur pressed the Eridu Genesis into clay, we hold that tablet in gloved hands and read words that might be mythology, might be memory, might be something between the two. The scribe is long dead. The city they lived in is ruined beneath desert. The language they spoke hasn't been spoken for 2,000 years, but their words survive, and those words whisper a possibility that we're still not certain how to interpret. The gods could die. If you've made it to the end of this journey, whether you began in daylight and are now watching darkness fall, or whether you started in the deep night and are now seeing dawn approach, you've traveled with us through 5,000 years of human memory, examining texts that preserve questions we still can't definitively answer. The Anunnaki are gone, if they existed. The cities they ruled are ruins. The civilizations they established have risen and fallen a dozen times over. But the question remains, pressed into clay and preserved through millennia, were they eternal, or were they merely very old? Were they gods, or were they something else? Powerful, yes. Knowledgeable, certainly, but ultimately mortal, operating within time, subject to the same final end that claims all things that exist within reality. The clay doesn't provide certainty. It only preserves the question. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps the value isn't in having the definitive answer, but in recognizing that the ancients asked questions that remain relevant, that they observed carefully, recorded precisely, and preserved their observations, so we might someday understand what they tried to tell us. Sleep now, if sleep is what you came here seeking. Let the questions rest as the clay has rested, patient in the darkness, waiting for someone to pick them up and wonder. The tablets will still be there tomorrow, in their climate-controlled vaults and museum displays, bearing their silent testimony. The Sumerian scribes did their part. They recorded, preserved, transmitted. Now the question belongs to us. What do we do with the possibility, however uncertain, however disputed, that the beings who established civilization were not eternal gods but mortal visitors who came, taught, built, ruled, died, and left behind only their systems and their stories? We do what the scribes did. We examine, we preserve, we pass forward, and we remember that the greatest mysteries are not those we've solved, but those we're still learning to properly ask. The clay tablets rest in their archives. The questions remain alive. And somewhere between certainty and uncertainty, between history and mythology, between what we know and what we wonder, the truth waits, patient as the clay itself, enduring, enigmatic, and silent.